enable Russia's prosecution of its brutal war against Ukraine. Earlier this month, the United States released further information documenting how Iran has provided Russia with hundreds of one-way attack UAVs as well as UAV production-related equipment. Ukraine and the UK also submitted evidence to the UN of Iranian UAVs recovered by the Ukrainian armed forces. Russia has not only procured hundreds of Mahar and Shahid series UAVs from Iran in clear violation of Resolution 2231, but it is also now working with Iran to produce these weapons inside Russia. Russia has been using these UAVs in recent weeks to strike Kyiv, destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, and kill and terrorize Ukrainian civilians. Media reports indicate just this week, Russia targeted Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities with dozens of Iranian-made drones. Russia's and Iran's actions violate UN Security Council Resolution 2231. That resolution prohibits all countries, including permanent members of the Security Council, from transferring these types of weapons from Iran absent advanced Security Council approval. Approval was, of course, not given. Ukraine, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and other countries have duly reported these violations to the United Nations and supplied the UN with additional information and analysis. The United Nations must respond to growing calls from the international community to investigate these violations. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, the Secretary General says he doesn't have a mandate to investigate. What do you say to that?
Look, 2231, Resolution 2231 does give the Secretary General a mandate to carry out these investigations, and we have all encouraged the UN to move forward on carrying out these investigations immediately.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you.
Don't run away. Now listen to the truth. It's not the first time that we hear allegations about us using Iranian drones in Ukraine. We categorically rejected. These are baseless allegations and blatant attempts to deliberately mislead the international community. The arguments that our colleagues are providing do not withstand any scrutiny and simply lack any legal or technical grounds. Their assumptions are limited to some kind of open source information and vague assessments. They provide incoherent photos of hardly identifiable debris of alleged UAVs. It looks they are not even sure themselves about the evidence they are providing. And it's not about facts, as you see, it's all about fake political narrative. Today, we have witnessed yet another attempt by the group of countries who you know. They are trying to give instructions to the Secretariat of the United Nations to conduct so-called investigations. Such actions represent blatant and explicit violation of paragraph 2 of Article 100 of the Charter of the United Nations and contradict the note by the President of the Security Council that clearly stipulates the mandate of the Secretariat in the context of implementation of Resolution 2231. I heard the question you asked the U.S. ambassador whether the 2231 provides for such type of investigations. It doesn't, because the cell that supports the 2231, it is not a group of experts. These people do not possess necessary expertise to conduct such kind of investigations and are not even equipped for that. And we expect the Secretariat to strictly abide by its mandate and not to yield to pressure exerted by some states. our country would regard any non-mandated activities by the Secretariat as deliberate provocation and undermine implementation of Resolution 2231. You perhaps know that there was a round of consultations between Ukraine and Iran. And when Iran requested the second round and to provide material evidence, nothing was provided. That speaks for itself.
Ambassador, why not let the Secretary General do an investigation? If you've got nothing to hide, you've done nothing wrong, you're not using Iranian drones, why don't you have an investigation that would clear Russia?
Us ourselves or the Secretariat?
Yes, why shouldn't the Secretary?
Because there is a mandate. Because there is a mandate of the group, and the group does not consist of experts to conduct such investigation.
The Secretary General could constitute experts. He can find experts.
That should be done in the context of bilateral relations with Ukraine, not through the Security Council. Security Council.
So you want to block an investigation. You don't want anyone.
We
to
say that
investigate
Secretariat cannot do it within the mandate of 2231. That's it. Thank you.
The 9,357th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Maintenance of Peace and Security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Czechia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Madam President. As we are all only too aware, the killing, destruction, and suffering continue unabated in Ukraine. 16 months since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, the prospects for peace remain desperately dim. Indeed, since the last time I briefed the Council on Ukraine, the war has escalated and become more fluid and unpredictable. The impact of the intensifying violence on civilians remains our gravest concern. Russian missile barrages and drone attacks across Ukraine nearly tripled in May. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 24,862 civilian casualties to date. The breakdown is as follows: 9,083 civilians killed, including 530 children, and 15,779 injured, including 1,086 children. Since my last briefing, then, 2,131 civilians have been confirmed killed. The actual figures are likely considerably higher. Since February 2022, OHCHR has also verified a total of 1,036 attacks impacting educational and medical facilities. 649 attacks occurred on territory controlled by the government of Ukraine, 301 on territory occupied by the Russian Federation, and 86 on territory that was contested at the time of the attack. The World Health Organization has verified over 1,000 cases of attacks on healthcare, with 101 deaths and 139 injuries. Of these, 898 incidents have affected health facilities, and 273 impacted health supplies. Most attacks involve the use of heavy weapons. Also, UNESCO has verified damage to 260 sites since February 2022, including 112 religious sites, 22 museums, 94 buildings of historic significance, 19 monuments, 12 libraries, and 1 archive. Madam President, the most significant destruction of civilian infrastructure to date took place on 6 June, when the Kakhovka Dam was damaged. While the exact circumstances remain unclear, this is a catastrophe that will have massive adverse consequences. Some 80 communities along the Dnipro River were reportedly flooded, with tens of thousands of people directly affected. Dozens of people have lost their lives. The Kakhovka Reservoir, one of Europe's largest and a source of drinking water for at least 700,000 people, has lost 70% of its capacity, according to Ukrainian authorities. Concerns continue to mount that floodwaters could shift landmines into previously cleared areas, further endangering lives. Damaged sewer systems and the lack of clean water heighten the risk of waterborne diseases. Inundated farmland is a further blow to the already beleaguered agriculture and food production sector. The UN is already engaged in assessing the extent of the environmental and ecological needs stemming from this human-made catastrophe. As reported by the IAEA, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is planning to resume pumping water that remains accessible despite a major loss of water in the Kakhovka Reservoir. However, the safety and security situation at the plant is extremely fragile. Any threat to the plant and other sensitive infrastructure is dangerous and unacceptable. Madam President, as part of our immediate response to the incident, the UN and humanitarian partners have rushed to deliver supplies and evacuation support for hundreds of thousands in the affected area. The UN country team has been fully mobilized in this vital effort in close cooperation with Ukrainian authorities and local partners. We are deeply disturbed by reports that evacuating civilians and emergency personnel have been shelled. There are still people we are unable to reach, especially in low-lying communities under Russian control. The Russian Federation has so far declined our request to go to these areas. The UN will continue to seek the next necessary access. We urge Russian authorities to act in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law and ensure safe and unfettered access to all areas in need. Aid cannot be denied to people who need it. We are also concerned about the reported damage to the Tolyatti-Odessa pipeline, the world's largest ammonia conduit in Ukraine's Kharkiv region. The circumstances of the incident remain unclear. Let me say it again. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. All such attacks must stop immediately, whether they be on Ukrainian, Russian-controlled, or Russian territory. Madam President, the United Nations continues to monitor and report on human rights violations and to support efforts toward accountability. To date, OHCHR has documented 158 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, with the majority committed by members of Russian armed forces and penitentiary system personnel. We remain deeply concerned about the cases of forcible transfers of protected persons, including children, to territories of Ukraine under Russian control and consequent deportations to Russia. This critical issue impacting the most vulnerable needs to be addressed urgently, prioritizing the reunification of families. Separately, we welcome the continued efforts by the parties to enable the return of prisoners of war and urge the sides to fulfill their obligations regarding the treatment of prisoners of war and other detainees. Accountability for all violations of international, humanitarian, and human rights law remains of paramount importance. Madam President, since its signing in July last year, the Black Sea Initiative has enabled the safe transportation of over 32 million metric tons of foodstuffs, helping to drive down global food prices. More than half of what has been exported has gone to developing countries. We are, however, disappointed by the slow pace of the implementation of the initiative. Food exports through the maritime humanitarian corridor have dropped from a peak of 4.2 million metric tons in October to 1.3 million metric tons in May, the lowest volume since the initiative began. We urge all obstacles to be removed to ensure the continuation of this agreement. The United Nations is also fully committed to supporting the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding on Russian food and fertilizer exports. Now, before war began, we consistently warned about the impact of a major conflict in Ukraine and what it could have on the region and beyond. Recent developments are not assuring in this regard. The announced deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, for example, and the accompanying rhetoric have raised regional tensions further. We urge all involved to act responsibly and in accordance with international obligations. We reiterate that any threat to use nuclear weapons is unacceptable. As the conflict has intensified, there have also been increased diplomatic efforts and initiatives by member states seeking de-escalation and calling for a peaceful settlement. The United Nations stands ready to support all meaningful efforts to bring a just and sustainable peace to Ukraine. In this, we are guided by the UN Charter, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions, as the Secretary General emphasized during his visit to Ukraine in March, and as I reiterated last week in Moscow. Madam President, this war has created a humanitarian and human rights catastrophe, traumatized a generation of children, and accelerated the global food and energy crises. It has weakened the international collective security system we have all pledged to uphold. We cannot discount further dangerous knock-on effects. An end to the war, founded on international law and the Charter, is the surest way to ensure that the tremendous suffering of the last 16 months will cease. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank you, Ms. DiCarlo, for her in-depth and, as always, professional briefing on the current developments in Ukraine. Today is the 485th day of the special, brutal military aggression in Ukraine. The devastating consequences of this unprovoked and unjustified war need no further explanation. Ms. DiCarlo just provided an updating list. Civilian casualties are added on a daily basis. Millions are still refugees in the neighboring countries, and many others are internally displaced. War crimes, crimes against humanity, including conflict-related sexual violence, have been meticulously documented. Residential areas and critical infrastructure continue to be under constant attack. Kyiv, the capital, has been under continuous and increased attacks with missiles and illegal Iranian drones acquired in clear violations of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, including when foreign dignitaries are or have been in town. It happened when the Secretary General visited Kyiv. It happened again last week when African leaders were making a case for peace. Madam President, We have raised the dramatic situation of children in Ukraine, including their deportation, more than once in our meetings. It has always been denied. Now, the annual report, UN report on children in armed conflict, just released, has included the Russian military forces and proxy armed groups on its list of shame over the killing and maiming of hundreds of children in its war against Ukraine. It presents the shocking high number of attacks on schools and hospitals and protected personnel, and the high number of children killed, abducted, recruited, and sexually abused by the Russian forces and affiliated armed groups. No one should be surprised. It is just one of the chapters of the dark reality of this horrible war. Colleagues, we have called constantly for the war to stop, for the reason to prevail, and for a return to diplomacy and dialogue. Our calls have been ignored. We see no sign and no desire from Kremlin to change course. Kremlin remains defiant, including by infusing a lot of noisy talk about possible use of nuclear weapons in various Russian media and talk shows, while tactical nuclear weapons have started to be deployed in Belarus. But there is worse. Recently, the Russian parliament's lower house, the State Duma, has approved legislation that would give pardons to criminal convicts who volunteered to join Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. The practice of recruiting prisoners and criminals and throwing them to the war in Ukraine as cannon fodder was first adopted by the Wagner Group. It was shocking, but it was Wagner, a mercenary. Now it is the turn of the Russian army to do the same. Last year, at the early days of this aggression, we were lectured about the virtues of the Russian armed forces, who, as said, would never commit sexual crimes. A lot has happened since then. The UN and human rights groups have unquestionably documented terrible crimes, including rape committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine. But calling criminals, killers, and rapists under a regular uniform, precisely those who have been taken out of the streets as a danger to the society, giving them weapons and a license to kill, represents more than just a danger. That indicates that the Russian army is being Wagnerized. Given the terrible record of Wagner Group in Ukraine and in many parts of the world, the reputation of the Russian army will hardly be improved. This war is changing many things, including Russia itself, but not for the better. Madam President, 2 days ago, at the Ukraine Recovery Conference held in London, the international community renewed its commitment to full support for Ukraine and its people. The World Bank has estimated that more than $400 billion are needed today to rebuild Ukraine. Had there been no war, those billions would have been used elsewhere for other purposes, to mitigate climate change effects or to feed more of those in dire need, everywhere, including primarily in the global south. But the reality is that Russia has destroyed or damaged 1,500 hospitals and healthcare facilities, has destroyed or damaged 10% of Ukraine's education institutions and 50% of its power generation infrastructure. Close to 2.5 million people need new homes, and 30% of Ukraine's territory has been contaminated by landmines and shells. All this continues to this hour, making the scale of destruction unlike anything seen in Europe since the Second World War. This is why this madness that has lasted for far too long must stop. From a political, moral, and legal perspective, Russia will be held accountable for its war of choice and should pay the human and physical damage caused to the Ukrainian people. In this respect, we welcome the establishment of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine at Eurojust in The Hague. Colleagues, a few days ago, Russia announced its intention to hold elections in September in the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied. We reiterate our position not to recognize any territories acquired by force and their attempted annexation. Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol belong to Ukraine. A permanent member of the Security Council knows that any attempt to legitimize illegal control on the territory of another country is a clear violation of sovereignty, of international law, and the UN Charter. Let me conclude with a bizarre, very bizarre, yet unfortunately true fact. Last week, on Europe Square in Moscow, a statue of Slobodan Milosevic, known as the Butcher of the Balkans, was inaugurated by people close to Kremlin. Those who hope to perpetuate Milosevic's memory for the posterity should know that he was responsible for the bloody breakup of the former Yugoslavia, otherwise the last war in Europe before Russia took the baton. He is directly responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of Bosnians, Croats, and Kosovo Albanians, and for the ethnic cleansing of over 3 million people. He was surrendered to the ICTY, a tribunal created by the Security Council, and indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. He died alone in prison. Some kilograms of bronze won't turn Milosevic into a hero, but it is sad to think that from now on, whoever wants to honor and glorify a war criminal can go to pilgrimage in Moscow. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your briefing today. Moments ago, I stood with Ukraine, France, the United Kingdom, and Albania to call out Russia and Iran's flagrant violations of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. We know the Kremlin has procured hundreds of UAVs and is now working with Iran to produce these weapons inside Russia. And we know that in recent weeks, the Kremlin has used these UAVs to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure and kill and terrorize civilians. The United Nations must implement Security Council Resolution 2231. We still have no explanation as to why experts from the 2231 team have not been dispatched to Ukraine to review evidence of these weapons' origins and the destruction these weapons have caused. The UN must act with urgency. This is a matter of life or death for the Ukrainian people. Russia's cruel and relentless attacks have left millions of homes in Ukraine without light, without heat, without water. And recent strikes in Kherson have killed civilians, including aid workers delivering assistance to those fleeing flooding after the Kakhovka Dam's destruction. As we speak, Russia is blocking the UN from getting aid to people in the flooded areas. That's unacceptable. Russia must immediately allow the UN to deliver desperately needed humanitarian assistance to occupied areas of Ukraine. Humanitarian workers must have safe passage as they deliver aid and assistance to those in need, full stop. Colleagues, Moscow publicly feigns deep concerns about attacks on critical infrastructure, and they have called Security Council meetings to try to convince us of that. But Russia's hypocrisy is on full display as we watch Russian missiles and drones reduce entire Ukrainian cities to rubble. And for what? President Putin is hell-bent on beating a foreign country into submission. But the Ukrainian people will never, never give up their sovereignty, their democracy, their freedom. President Putin thought his forces would march into Ukraine with little to no resistance, but he was wrong. The Ukrainian people have demonstrated remarkable bravery and grit. President Putin thought he would face no consequences from the international community. Then he hoped the international community would tire of his war and simply move on. But here too, he was wrong. More than 140 countries have repeatedly voted to condemn Russia's war of choice, and more than 140 countries voted to support a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on UN principles. To that end, all efforts to broker peace must be rooted in the UN Charter's most fundamental principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the inherent rights of self-defense. All of us here would insist on the same if we were in Ukraine's place. And of course, peace requires good faith efforts from all parties. Let's not forget that on the very day President Zelenski presented his peace formula to the G20 last year, Russia unleashed missile strikes across Ukraine. And let's not forget that Russia carried out an airstrike against Kyiv when the Secretary General was visiting Ukraine last April. And just last week, as you heard, when a delegation of African leaders traveled to Kyiv in pursuit of peace, they were greeted by a barrage of Russian missiles. So let's not both sides this issue. Russia has demonstrated no meaningful interest in negotiating toward peace. There must be a sustained, unified clarion call for President Putin to end his brutal war of aggression. Because the longer the war goes on, the more the Ukrainian people will suffer and the more the world will suffer. After all, the impacts of this war are now being felt around the world. Why? Because President Putin has used food as a weapon of war, and in doing so, has exacerbated global food insecurity. For a long time, Russia blocked Ukrainian grain from leaving the Black Sea, grains that help feed so much of the world, especially in Africa and the Middle East. That's what makes the Black Sea Grain Initiative such a critical arrangement, one that we must extend next month for the benefit of all. And that's why it is deeply troubling that Russia is once again the only country threatening to withdraw from the initiative. As the new grain harvest begins in Ukraine and Russia, this arrangement becomes even more important. Colleagues, we must urge Russia to stay in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We must beam a bright light on member states that violate Security Council resolutions, including through the timely investigation of violations, and we must continue to hold Russia accountable for its crimes against the Ukrainian people. And we must continue to call on Russia to silence its guns and embrace diplomacy. Until it does so, the United States will continue to support Ukraine in its principled self-defense against Russia's savage attacks. Caving to Moscow's aggression would endanger every single country, big and small, new and old, all of us. We must never let war become a viable path for withdrawing international borders. We must uphold the UN Charter and international peace and security, and we must continue to stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Madam President, I thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. Today marks 1 year and 4 months since the start of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And since then, the Ukrainian people have been fighting for their sovereignty and territorial integrity, which are protected under the UN Charter. But more importantly, they have been they have been fighting for their own lives, family and friends and peace, which was all of a sudden broken by Russia. Here and now, we reaffirm our resolute solidarity and support for Ukraine. We once again express our deepest sympathies to all those affected by the collapse of the dam at Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant for their loss and suffering, destroying efforts of Ukrainians who strenuously worked for their future. We express our profound concerns over the reported shelling during the evacuation and Russia's denial of access to affected areas for the UN humanitarian aid, as stated by the Humanitarian Coordinator for Ukraine, Denise Brown. In response to the crisis, Japan immediately decided to provide an emergency humanitarian assistance of $5 million in such areas as food, water, and sanitation, and health through WFP, UNICEF, IOM, and UNHCR. We sincerely hope our assistance, together with the other ones, be swiftly delivered to the people in need without hindrance. In addition, Japan will provide approximately 160 water purifiers, 30 drain pumps, 4,000 plastic water containers, and 20 large water tanks through JICA, as well as 530 generators and 30 construction machines, along with awareness-raising activities as a main action for local people through UNDP. Madam President, Russia's aggression has had a negative impact on people all around the world, and we are taking steps to support partners worldwide as they respond to the suffering it has caused. We are also building on the success of our efforts to ensure that Russia is no longer able to weaponize the availability of energy and food supplies against us and against the world. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. We will not tire in our commitment to do everything we can to stop or mitigate the impact of Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine and on the rest of the world. And in this regard, Black Sea initiatives has to continue without delay. Madam President, Japan values the serious engagement efforts of many countries, including the African leaders, in realizing peace in Ukraine. We would like to underline that a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace cannot be realized without the complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops and military equipment. This is a demand of the General Assembly and should be included accordingly in any call for peace. Peace must be based on the principles of the UN Charter, and in this regard, an unjust peace which defies the Charter would be a victory for the aggressor. Any attempts to change the status quo of territory by force or coercion must be rejected anywhere in the world. Other member states should also refrain from supporting the aggression either directly or indirectly. Madam President, recently, Belarus announced that they started taking delivery of Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Japan condemns Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons as a serious and unacceptable menace to the peace and security of the international community. The record of 77 years of non-use of nuclear weapons must not be broken. We urge Russia and Belarus to cease any actions that may increase tensions. Madam President, it is Russia that initiated this unprovoked aggression. It must stop the aggression right here and now. No other way than ending the aggression could eliminate the root cause of the immediate immense suffering. There must be no impunity for war crimes and other atrocities. Justice must be done, and those who are responsible for the undeniable atrocities must be held accountable. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I thank Under-Secretary General, Ms. Rosemary DiCarmo, for our briefing. I acknowledge the attendance in this session of the permanent representative of Ukraine. Madam President, 1.5 years on since the start of the current conflict, the Security Council members have held more than 100 formal and informal meetings, including area formal sessions. This bears the testimony to the gravity of the situation we are facing. We must admit the reality that despite repeated calls for cessations of hostilities, compromise, dialogue, and return to the negotiating table, the conflict continues relentless. An alarming downward spiral is taking hold on the confrontation manifested in a dangerous armed race, millions of refugees and internally displaced people, destruction of civilian infrastructures, thus generating dire and humanitarian situation. This is taking place against the backdrop of an increasing pessimism in the ability of our multilateral peace and security architecture to cope with multiple security challenges and questions about its legitimacy as to whether it is still fit for purpose. Despite several goodwill attempts at negotiation, most notably the recent initiative by some African heads of states and the government, These are met with skepticism and quickly dismissed as unsuitable not stats. This testifies the high level of mistrust between the contending parties without whom attempts at peace are condemned to fail. Madam President, cognizant of unwillingness of the parties concerned for a political negotiated solution, it is Mozambique's firm conviction, born out of our own journey toward peace and national reconciliation, that all avenues to bring this conflict to an end must genuinely be explored. Needless to say, the price of war in humankind's history has been always more expensive than the price of peace. For that purpose, it is fundamental to give force of reason a chance, rather than the reason of force. In fact, this conflict has gone too far and has brought us to this dangerous juncture. The potential of miscalculated decision by nations involved directly and indirectly in the war moving forward may have disastrous and unimaginable consequences for all the waiting batch. No solutions, however, will be fruitless without genuine political will from the main parties and their supporters to engage in negotiations. Only their good faith and genuine intent to save lives and indeed the entire humanity can stop this war. It is against this background that Mozambique reiterates its call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the return to direct negotiations between the parties as a matter of urgent in full respect for the UN Charter and the Council decisions in relevant matters of peace and security. I thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USD DiCarlo for the update on the impacts of the conflict on the Ukrainian population. We deeply regret the thousands of deaths officially recorded by the Office of the High Representative for Human Rights since February 2022, and deplore the continuing destruction of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Brazil extends its solidarity to the families of the victims and reaffirms its support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We share the disappointment of others with the absence of dialogue between the parties and the insistence on the pursuit of a military solution. We are concerned about the intensification of fighting along the front lines and the placement of nuclear weapons in a non-nuclear weapon state. We reiterate our deep concern about the risks to the integrity of the nuclear facilities in Zaporizhzhia, especially after the rupture of the Kakhovka Dam. Avoiding damage to the nuclear power plant is imperative. Brazil urges the parties to collaborate to ensure the supply of water for cooling the reactors and spent fuel. We also echo the call by the Humanitarian Coordinator for Ukraine, Ms. Denise Brown, for Russian authorities to facilitate access to areas under their control. The rupture of the Kakhovka Dam endangered thousands of people on both sides of the Dnieper River who depend on humanitarian assistance provided by the United Nations. Madam President, in recent weeks, the voices of members of the international community in favor of an immediate cessation of hostilities have multiplied. Brazil followed with great interest the visit of African leaders to Kyiv and Moscow. We endorse the words of President Macky Sall of Senegal. Even in the midst of fighting, it is necessary to keep open the channels of dialogue. Otherwise, it will not be possible to escape the trap of espousing a purely military logic. Brazil supports the proposals of de-escalation of hostilities, exchange of prisoners of war, and peace negotiations based on the principles of the UN Charter that take into account the legitimate security concerns of all parties. It is also essential to bear in mind the adverse impacts this conflict has on third countries due to the increased price of food and agricultural inputs. As South African President Cyril Ramaphosa pointed out a few days ago, this conflict is affecting Africa negatively. The same applies to other regions, including my own, Latin America and the Caribbean. Due consideration must be given to calls for normalization of the grain and fertilizer trade. Sustainable peace, Madam President, cannot result from the imposition of unilateral terms under the coercion of arms on either side. We urge the parties to avoid entrenching themselves in their positions. The policy of isolation and the imposition of unilateral sanctions have already demonstrated their limits. We encourage the parties to explore alternative paths, starting with the cessation of hostilities and the resumption of direct negotiations. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席女士，
Madam President,
我感谢
I
迪
thank
卡洛副秘书长
USG
的
De
通报。
Carlo for her briefing.
针对当前乌克
In
兰危
light
机
of
的
the
形
current
势，
situation of the
中
Ukraine
方愿
crisis,
强调以
China
下几点
wishes：to stress the following points.
一，
First,
要全力
every
防
effort
止
must be
局
made
势
to
失
prevent
控
the。situation from spiraling out of
一
control.
段时间以来
For，some
乌克
time
兰
now,
战
the
事
fighting
持
in
续升
Ukraine
级，
has continued to
扩大化
escalate
趋势
with an
一发
ever
明显，
clearer trend of expansion
不确定性
and
显著增强。
significantly greater uncertainties.
卡霍夫卡大坝被
The
毁事件
destruction of
再次提醒我
Kakhovka
们，
Dam
如果
once
任由
again
战
reminds
火
us
延
that
宕下
if
去，
the fighting is left
只会
to
带
drag
来
on,
更多
there will
重大
only
风
be
险。
more major
任
risks,
何可怕
and
的
any
场景
horrible
都有可
scenario
能发
could
生。
materialize.
我们希望
We hope
冲
that
突双方
both parties
保
to
持
the
冷
conflict
静
will stay
克制，
calm and exercise
国际
restraint,
社会
and that the
避免
international
加剧
community
紧
will
张，
refrain from escalating
特
the
别是要
tensions,
严守
in
核
particular,
安全底线，
strictly safeguard the
远离
bottom line
核
of
战
nuclear
争红
safety
线，
and stay far away from
全
the
力
red
避免
line
造
of
成
nuclear
无
war.
法挽回的
Everything
局
must
面。
be done to avoid a point of no return.
二，
Second,
要全力
every
减
effort
缓
must be
民众
made
苦
to
难。
alleviate the suffering of the people.
中方再次呼吁
China
有关
once
各
again
方
calls upon
严
the
格遵
parties
守国
concerned
际
to
人道法，
strictly abide by
严
international
格履
humanitarian
行保
law,
护平民
strictly
义务，
fulfill the obligations
保
to
障妇
protect
女、儿
civilians,
童等弱势
guarantee
群
the
体安
safety
全，
of women, children,
尊
and
重
other
战俘
vulnerable
基本
groups,
权利。
and respect the basic rights of
我们
prisoners
鼓
of
励国
war.
际社会和人
We
道机
encourage
构
the international
在恪
community
守
and
人道救援
humanitarian
原则的基
agencies
础上，
to step up their
加大对
assistance
受危机影
to
响民众的
populations
人道救
affected
援
by
力
the
度。
crisis on the basis of adhering to the principles
三，
governing humanitarian
要
aid.
全力管
Third,
控外溢影
every
响。
effort must be made to manage the
中
spillover
方对乌克
effects.
兰危机给世
China
界
is
经济复
seriously
苏，
worried about the
特别是
impact
发
of the
展中国
Ukraine
家
crisis
在
on
后
the
疫情
recovery
时代
of the
实
world
现可
economy,
持续发
and in
展目标
particular
造
the
成的冲
attainment
击，
by developing
表示
countries
严重
of the
担忧。
SDGs in the
我们呼吁
post-pandemic
各
era.
方
We
共
call
同
upon
努
all
力，
parties to join
降低危
efforts
机的
to
负面影
reduce
响，
the negative impact of
维
the
护全
crisis,
球产业链
keep global
供应链稳定，
industrial and supply chains
敦促有
stable,
关国家
and urge
立即取
relevant
消
countries
所
to
谓的
immediately
单边制裁
lift
和长
the
臂管辖。
so-called unilateral sanctions and long-arm
黑海粮食外
jurisdiction.
运协议
The
应
Black
得
Sea
到
Grain
均衡、
Initiative
全
should be
面、
implemented
有效执
in
行。
a balanced, comprehensive,
联合
and
国同俄
effective
罗斯
manner.
签署的备忘录
And the
应得到
MOU signed between the
认真
UN
落
and
实。
Russia should be implemented in earnest.
四，
Fourth,
要全力推
every
动
effort
对话
must be
谈
made
判
to。promote dialogue and negotiation.
近期，南非等
Recently,
非洲6国
A
领导
peace
人组成的
delegation
和平代表
consisting
团
of the
访
leaders
问
of
乌克
6
兰
African
和
countries,
俄罗
including
斯。
South Africa,
中方
visited
对此表示欢
Ukraine
迎，
and Russia. China welcomes
我们
this.
希望世界上
We
爱好
hope
和
that
平、坚持
countries
正义
in
的
the
国
world
家
that love peace
都
and
能发
uphold
出劝
justice
和促谈的
will
理性
send
声音。
rational messages in promotion of
无论
peace
面临
talks.
多大困难，
However
乌
significant
克
the
兰问题政
difficulties,
治解决
the
的大
door
门
to the
都
political
不能关
settlement
上，
of the Ukraine crisis
止
must
战
not be
促谈的
closed.
努力
Efforts
都
to
不能
stop
松
the
懈，
fighting and promote talks
外
must
交
not
谈判的进
relent,
程
and the
都不
process
能
of
停止。
diplomatic negotiations must not stall.
要推动各方
It's
加
important
强
to
接
work
触
for，all parties to
凝
enhance
聚共识，
engagement, build
形成
consensus,
最大公约数，
form the broadest
为危
common
机的最
ground,
终解
and
决
gradually
逐步
accumulate
积累
and create
和创造
conditions
条
for
件
the。final settlement of the crisis.
主席女士，
Madam President,
在乌克兰问题上，
on the
中
Ukraine
方始
issue,
终主
China
张
has always
各国
maintained
主权
that
和
the
领土完
sovereignty
整
and territorial
都
integrity
应
of all
得到维
countries
护，
should be upheld.
联合国宪章宗
The
旨和原
purposes
则
and principles of
都
the
应
UN
得到遵
Charter
守，
should be
各方
observed.
合理安全关切都
Legitimate
应得到
security
重视，
concerns of all parties should be
一切
valued,
有利于和平解决危机
and
的
all
努力
efforts
都
conducive
应
to
得
the
到
peaceful
支持。
settlement of the crisis should be supported.
中方将继续
China
同
will
国际社
continue
会
to
一
work
道，
with the international
为推动
community
乌
and
克兰
play an
问题的
active and
政治解
constructive
决
role in promoting
发
the
挥
political
积极
settlement
和建设
of the
性作用。
Ukraine issue.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam
Je
President.
voudrais commencer
I
par
wish to take this
remercier la secrétaire
opportunity to
générale
begin
adjointe
by
Di
thanking
Carlo
the Undersecretary
de son
General, Madame Di
intervention
Carlo,
et de
for
tous
her
ses efforts.
statement and for all of
Il y
the
a quelques
efforts that she has
semaines, le
undertaken.
secrétaire général
Several
des
weeks ago,
Nations
the
Unies
Secretary
nous a
General of the
rappelé
United
que le droit
Nations
international
reminded us of the
humanitaire
fact that
fait toute la
international
différence
humanitarian
entre
law
la vie et la mort,
makes all of the
entre la retenue
difference
et
between
l'anarchie.
life and death, between
Je
restraint
regrette que
and
depuis
anarchy.
lors, la
I regret
véridicité
that
de ces
since then, the
propos
truth of
a
these
été
remarks
conformée de
was
nouveau
borne out
tristement
once
en
again,
Ukraine dans le
unfortunately,
contexte de
in
l'agression
Ukraine,
militaire russe.
in the context of the Russian
Ces
military
dernières semaines,
aggression.
des attaques
In recent
continues de
weeks,
missiles russes ont à
ongoing
nouveau touché
Russian
des
missile
zones
attacks
résidentielles dans
again
plusieurs villes
targeted
ukrainiennes.
residential areas
Je
in a
répète que
number
les
of
vies et
Ukrainian
les
cities. I wish to
infrastructures
recall
civiles
that
doivent
civilian
être
lives
protégées.
and infrastructure
La
need
Suisse
to be
condamne toute
protected.
attaque
Switzerland
indiscriminée et
condemns all
disproportionnée.
indiscriminate
Les
and
auteurs doivent
disproportionate
être traduits en
attacks.
justice.
The perpetrators need to be brought to
En plus de la
justice.
protection
In
accordée aux
addition to
biens
the protection
civils, les
afforded
ouvrages et
to
installations
civilian
contenant des forces
property,
dangereuses bénéficient d'une
works and
protection
facilities
particulière.
containing
La Suisse est donc
dangerous
profondément préoccupée
equipment
par les
enjoy
conséquences
particular
humanitaires,
protection. Switzerland is
écologiques et
very much
économiques
concerned by the
des inondations
humanitarian,
dues à la
ecological,
destruction du
economic
barrage de
consequences
Nova
of the flooding
Au
as a
manque d'eau
consequence of the
potable s'ajoute
destruction
une
of the
multitude
Novakhovka
d'autres défis,
Dam.
notamment
A
le
lack
risque
of
posé par
drinking
des
water
mines
is
et des restes
compounded by
explosifs de
many
guerre
other challenges,
déplacés par l'eau,
specifically the
qui
risk
compliquent
posed by
l'acheminement de l'aide
mines and
humanitaire
explosive
et le
remnants
déminage
of war
humanitaire.
displaced by water. And
Nous
this
saluons
complicates the
les
delivery of
efforts
humanitarian
incessants des
assistance and
acteurs
humanitarian
humanitaires, notamment de
demining.
l'ONU,
We
du
applaud
CICR
the
et des acteurs
unstinting
locaux
efforts
pour
undertaken by
venir en aide
humanitarian
à toutes les
actors,
personnes
specifically the
touchées.
United Nations, the
Nous demandons
ICRC,
instamment au
local
gouvernement
actors as
russe
well, in
d'agir
delivering assistance
conformément
to
à
all
ses
affected
obligations en
people.
vertu du droit
We
international
urge the Russian
humanitaire
government
et
to operate
d'autoriser et
in
faciliter
line
l'accès
with its
humanitaire
obligations
sûr,
under international
rapide et sans
humanitarian
entrave
law,
au territoire
and to
ukrainien
foster, to
actuellement sous
facilitate
son
and
contrôle.
authorize safe,
La destruction du barrage
prompt,
illustre les risques que
and
fait courir
unimpeded
la
humanitarian
poursuite de
access
l'agression
to
militaire russe
Ukrainian
aux
territory currently
infrastructures
under its
avec des
control.
conséquences
The destruction of the
désastreuses pour la
barrage
population
illustrates the
civile.
risks
Elle
that
augmente
continued Russian
également le
military
risque d'une nouvelle
aggression poses
escalade,
to
y
infrastructure with
compris un
devastating
incident
consequences
nucléaire.
to civilian
La
populations.
Suisse se
This
félicite de
also
l'engagement
heightens the risk
continu
of
de la
further
IEA pour la
escalation,
protection
including a
de la
nuclear
centrale
incident.
nucléaire de
Switzerland
Zaporizhzhia
welcomes the
et les
ongoing
autres
commitment of the
installations nucléaires en
IAEA for the
Ukraine.
protection of the
Nous
Zaporizhzhia
réaffirmons
nuclear
notre
plant
soutien
and other
pratique,
nuclear facilities
financier
in
et
Ukraine.
politique
We
aux travaux
reaffirm
de
our
l'IEA.
practical, financial, and
Nous
political
appelons la
support
Russie
for
et
the work of the
l'Ukraine à strictement
IAEA.
respecter le
We
droit international
urge the
humanitaire
Russian
protégeant
Federation
les
and
objets
Ukraine
civils
to
et
strictly
les
respect
ouvrages et
international
installations
humanitarian
contenant
law
des
protecting
forces
civilian
dangereuses,
objects
ainsi que de s'engager à
and
respecter les 5
works and
principes
facilities
établis par
containing
l'IEA.
dangerous material as well
Madame
as is to
Présidente, alors que notre
engage with and
attention se
respect the
concentre
5
sur les défis
principles established by
immédiats,
the
nous
IAEA.
devons
As
néanmoins
our
penser à
attention is
l'avenir,
focused on immediate
conserver
challenges, we
l'espoir.
need to
La Suisse
contemplate
salue
the
la
future
solidarité
and
exprimée
generate
lors
hope.
de la conférence
Switzerland
sur la
applauds
reconstruction
the
de l'Ukraine à
solidarity
Londres cette
expressed
semaine.
during the Ukraine
Avec le cycle
recovery
des
conference
conférences,
held
nous sommes
this week
résolus
in
à
London.
offrir de
With the
meilleures
cycle of
perspectives au
conferences,
peuple
we've
ukrainien.
resolved to offer
Il est
better
essentiel que la
prospects for the
reconstruction se
Ukrainian
fasse de
people.
manière
It is vital
participative
for
et
reconstruction to
transparente,
be carried
comme le
out in a
soulignent les principes de
participatory
Lugano.
and
En
transparent
parallèle de
manner,
cette
as is
manifestation de
emphasized in the
soutien,
Lugano
la
principles.
Suisse suit de
In
près
parallel
les
with this
différents
manifestation of
engagements
support,
avec le but
Switzerland has
d'avancer
been
la paix
closely
en Ukraine.
following various
La
engagements
conformité avec
aimed
les
at
principes de la la
peace
Charte
in
de l'ONU
Ukraine,
est pour nous la
compliance with the
condition de
principles
base
of the
dans ces
Charter of the United
réflexions.
Nations is for us a
L'initiative de
basic
la mer Noire a
requirement in
démontré
these
que l'engagement des
considerations.
acteurs
The
tiers
Black Sea
avec
Grain
toutes les parties
Initiative has
peut
demonstrated that
contribuer
the
à atténuer
commitment
les effets
and
négatifs
engagement
de la
of
guerre.
third actors with
Il
all
convient de s'appuyer
stakeholders can
sur
contribute
et
to
de
mitigating
développer
the
cet acquis.
adverse
Nous
consequences of the
regrettons
war.
que la
There's
tendance
a need to
aille dans
build
la
upon
direction
and to
opposée
enhance
et
these
appelons les
gains.
parties
We
à
regret that
redoubler
the trend is
d'efforts
moving in the
pour une
opposite
solution
direction.
durable.
We urge the
La
parties to
Suisse est
redouble
toujours
their
prête à
efforts
offrir
for a
ses bons
lasting
offices si les parties le
settlement.
souhaitent.
Switzerland
Madame la
continues to
Présidente,
stand ready to provide
le
its
respect
good
du droit
offices if the parties
international
so
est la seule
desire.
solution afin de
Respect for
parvenir à
international
une paix
humanitarian law
globale,
is the
juste et
only
durable en Ukraine.
solution to
Je
arrive at a
réitère donc
comprehensive,
aujourd'hui
just and
encore
lasting peace in
notre
Ukraine.
appel à
So
la
today I wish
Russie
to once
de
again call
cesser
upon
toutes
the
les
Russian Federation to
hostilités
cease
et
all
de retirer
hostilities
sans délai
and to,
toutes ses
without
troupes
delay,
du
withdraw
territoire
all of its
ukrainien.
troops
Je vous
from
remercie.
Ukrainian territory. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Under-Secretary General De Carlo, for your briefing. It's nearly 500 days since Russia's illegal and barbaric full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Let's again take stock of its impacts. Russia's airstrikes have reduced towns and cities to rubble. More than 9,000 civilians have been killed, including more than 500 children. Many thousands have been injured. Millions have been displaced, unable to return to their homes. Families have been torn apart, with children taken from their parents and sent to far-flung corners of Russia. Wherever Putin's government has attempted to take control of Ukraine, it has shown its true colours: a pattern of torture, killings, and brutal repression of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Last week, Russia rejected pleas from the United Nations to assist those in desperate need in the aftermath of the catastrophic destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. President, this is a war of choice for President Putin. He has shown contempt and disregard for Russia's obligations under the UN Charter. He is indifferent to the cost to Ukrainians, to Russians, and to the world. He fires missiles at Kyiv, even as world leaders visit Moscow, seeking to build peace. He supplies his armies from UN-sanctioned states like Iran and DPRK, further undermining global security. He continues to hold the world's food to ransom by holding up grain shipments under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The World Bank has estimated that Ukraine's reconstruction needs are over $400 billion. Russia's destruction adds more pressure to the global economy, already suffering from conflict, climate change, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The world needs peace, but Ukraine will never have peace while Russian forces remain on its territory. So we call on Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine and end this illegal war of aggression. At the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London this week, my Prime Minister paid tribute to Ukraine's incredible spirit, a spirit of strength and defiance, but also of ingenuity and innovation. We will stand with the people of Ukraine for as long as it takes for them to win a just and sustained peace that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. And we'll also stand with them as they win the peace and rebuild a country shattered by Russia's aggression. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you,
Je
Madam
remercie la
President. I
secrétaire
wish
générale
to
adjointe
thank
Rosemary
Under-Secretary
DiCarlo.
General Rosemary
Madame la
DiCarlo.
Présidente,
Madam
la
President,
violence meurtrière et les
the
souffrances
bloody violence
humaines
and human
demeurent
suffering
insoutenables
remain
avec les
unsustainable
combats qui
with
s'intensifient
the
en Ukraine.
fighting which is growing ever
Et
more
ce, en
intense in
dépit de
Ukraine.
l'initiative de
This
paix
is occurring in spite of
portée
the
notamment
peace
par des chefs
initiatives
d'État
adopted
africains
by African
dont
heads of
l'objectif
state. The goal
était
of that
et
peace
demeure
plan
de frayer un
was and
chemin
remains
vers la
that
désescalade
of
et le
paving the
dialogue
way towards
entre les
de-escalation and
belligérants.
dialogue between the warring parties.
La situation humanitaire
The
a empiré
humanitarian
ces dernières
situation
semaines
has worsened in
suite
recent
à la
weeks following the
destruction
destruction
du barrage
of
de
the Kakhovka
et des
hydroelectric
graves
dam
inondations
and the
qui en
serious
ont
flooding
résulté,
which
occasionnant
was caused
l'évacuation
by
de
it.
milliers
These
de
events
personnes
prompted the
et de
evacuation of
nombreux
thousands
dégâts
of persons
matériels.
and caused extensive
Selon
material
les
damage.
dernières statistiques
According
du
to the most
HCR
recent statistics
concernant
of the
les victimes
UNHCR
civiles
regarding
vérifiées,
civilian victims,
le nombre de morts s'élève
the
à
verified civilian victims, the number
9093
of
et
deaths
le
now
nombre de
stands
personnes
at some
blessées
9,000
à
and the number of
15
injured
779.
peoples now stands
Les
at some
populations et les
15,000.
infrastructures civiles
Civilian
continuent d'être
and
les
civilian
cibles
infrastructure
de
continue
bombardements
to be
directs.
the targets
Et
of
nous
direct
réitérons
shelling, and
notre
we
appel aux
reiterate
belligérants
our
à cesser
appeal
ces
to the
attaques
warring parties
et
to cease
bombardements
these
aveugles
attacks,
et
these
indiscriminés.
blind, indiscriminate
Nous appelons
attacks and
également
shelling.
les
We
parties
also call
à
upon parties
faciliter
to
l'accès des
facilitate
travailleurs
the access
humanitaires
of
aux
humanitarian workers
populations
to
qui ont
the
besoin d'une
people
aide
in
d'urgence
need of
et en
emergency
particulier
assistance,
dans les zones
in
sinistrées
particular in
par la
the areas
destruction du
affected
barrage
by the
de
destruction
Kakhovka.
of the Kakhovka
Madame la
hydroelectric
Présidente,
dam.
les
Madam
derniers
President, the
rapports
most
de la
recent
FAO
reports
et
of
du
the
PAM
FAO and the
alertent sur
WFP
le
warn
risque
of
d'une
the
aggravation
risk
de l'insécurité
of
alimentaire entre les
increasing
mois
food
de juin
insecurity
et
between the
de
months
novembre
of
de cette année.
June and November
Ce
of
sont des
this year.
perspectives très sombres
The outlook is
dans
very
22
bleak
pays
indeed for
risquant de
22
présenter
countries
18
who
foyers de
together
famine.
risk housing 18
L'inflation
hunger
induite
hotspots.
par ce conflit sur
Rising
les prix
food
des denrées
prices
alimentaires
caused by this
contribue
conflict
à
is
fragiliser
serving
les
to
pays à revenus
render
faibles
low
ou
and middle
intermédiaires.
income countries
Les
even
plus
more
touchés
fragile. Those
sont
most
aussi ceux
affected
qui
are
font
also
face
those countries
déjà
already
face à des défis
facing
sécuritaires
security
ou à des
challenges
conflits armés.
or armed
Et les
conflicts.
statistiques
And
montrent
statistics
qu'il y a
demonstrate
bien une
that
redirection d'une partie
it
de
is
l'aide
indeed
internationale
true that some
vers
international
l'Ukraine.
aid is now being
Laisser cette
redirected
guerre
towards
se
Ukraine.
poursuivre,
Letting
c'est
this war
prendre un
continue
pari
is to
sur
gamble
d'autres victimes
on there
civiles,
being more civilian
d'autres femmes
victims,
et d'autres
more
enfants
women and children
éplorés
plunged
et
into
des
grief,
destins brisés
and
par la
more
guerre et l'exil.
destinies, futures being
Mon pays
broken by war
continue
and exile.
d'exprimer
My
son
country
refus de la
continues
guerre
to
et d'appeler les
reject this
parties
war
à
and to
respecter
call
le
upon
droit
parties to
international
respect
humanitaire.
international
Les
humanitarian law.
belligérants
The warring
doivent
parties
s'abstenir
must
d'utiliser
refrain
des
from
armes aux
using
effets
weapons with
indiscriminés
indiscriminate
contre les
effects
civils
against
et
civilians
de
and
bombarder
must
les
refrain from
infrastructures
shelling
essentielles.
critical
Nous
infrastructure.
réitérons
We
également
also
notre appel aux
reiterate our
parties
appeal to the
à ne pas
parties
utiliser
not to
les infrastructures
use
civiles à des
civilian
fins
infrastructure
militaires.
for military
Nous restons
purposes.
attentifs
We
aux
continue to
initiatives de
closely
paix
follow
et aux offres de
peace
médiation
initiatives and
susceptibles
mediation offers
d'ouvrir la
liable
voie
to
vers
pave
une
the
issue
way towards
diplomatique.
a diplomatic
L'initiative
solution.
de la mer Noire nous
The
fonde
Black
à croire
Sea Grain
que la
Initiative
diplomatie
allows us to
finit
believe
toujours
that
par
diplomacy
triompher.
always ultimately
Nous saluons
triumphs.
le travail
We hail
que continuent de
the
réaliser
work
les agences des
that
Nations
the
Unies
UN
sur le
agencies
terrain
continue
pour
to
secourir et
undertake on the
protéger les
ground to
populations civiles
assist and protect
et nous
civilians, and we
reconnaissons le rôle
recognize the
important
important
du
role
CICR en
played by
direction
the
des personnes en détresse
ICRC
en
to
Ukraine
assist
et
persons
au-delà,
suffering in
notamment
Ukraine
son
and
action
beyond.
en direction des
We
prisonniers de
note
guerre.
namely its
Enfin, mon
work
pays
to assist
appelle
prisoners of war.
une fois de
Finally, my
plus
country
les
once again
parties
calls upon
à
parties
privilégier
to
le dialogue
prioritize
en
dialogue
vue d'une
with a
résolution
view
du
to
conflit.
finding a
Nous
peaceful
restons
solution to the
convaincus
conflict. We remain
qu'il n'y a pas
convinced that there
d'alternative
is no
crédible
credible
au dialogue
alternative to
et à la
dialogue
négociation
and
pour
negotiation
parvenir
to ultimately
à mettre
achieve
fin aux hostilités
a cessation of
et
hostilities
restaurer la
and
coexistence
to
pacifique
restore the
entre
peaceful
les belligérants.
coexistence
Je vous
of the
remercie.
warring parties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. statement, I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. I join previous speakers in thanking Under Secretary General, Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, for an informative briefing. We thank her for reaffirming the United Nations commitment to support efforts aimed at finding a lasting solution to the raging conflict in Ukraine and providing the needed humanitarian support. The United Nations, through its agencies and partners, have from the beginning of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine performed the indispensable function of providing life-saving humanitarian aid and assistance to the suffering people of Ukraine, and we are very appreciative of their efforts. Ghana continues to be deeply concerned by the unfolding circumstances in several regions of Ukraine. We regret that despite the many calls for the protection of civilians from harm, they still remain targets of missile and drone attacks. Civilians on a daily basis suffer the consequences of a war they never asked for. From the onset of the war in February 2022 to 4 June this year, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded not less than 24,000 civilian casualties, with close to 9,000 people killed and some 15,000 more injured. These numbers, along with the widespread destruction of infrastructure all across Ukraine, point to the gravity and abject futility of the war and reinforce the urgency of action needed to end it now rather than later. Over the past month, we have also witnessed a complex mix of challenges brought about by the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric dam. Our fears of negative environmental and social impact are borne out as communities reliant on the dam for water supply face challenges in accessing potable water. Reports also indicate the heightened risk of waterborne and hygiene-related diseases, as well as food security and livelihood challenges. Madam President, it is a difficult task to chronicle the myriad of suffering brought about by the war, and even more distressing is the growing intensity of hostilities as the parties remain polarized on a political settlement. With regard to our mandate of the maintenance of international peace and security, we cannot be despondent. Rather, we must, with unity of purpose, work together to restore the hope of peace to the people of Ukraine. During the Ukraine Recovery Conference held over the past 2 days in the United Kingdom, massive expressions of support and pledges have been made towards Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction, which now runs into billions of dollars. Such support, at a time when the aggression is still ongoing, demonstrates a persevering commitment by the international community to a new dawn of peace and prosperity in Ukraine. We remain convinced that these shared aspirations can be attained by bringing into full play range of tools for the pacific settlement of conflicts offered under the Charter of the United Nations. It is for this reason that we have consistently advocated for dialogue and diplomacy as the best channels for reaching a comprehensive, sustainable, and durable peace between the two countries. Once more, we urge respect for the rules of international law and the principles and core values of the Charter of the United Nations. We further urge the parties to commit to engaging in constructive dialogue in good faith and with a view to narrowing down their differences. While reiterating calls for the cessation of hostilities, we remind the parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law to refrain from causing deliberate harm to civilians and avoid the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure. With regard to nuclear safety and security, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency has warned that the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is extremely fragile, and reiterated the call on the warring parties to adhere to basic principles designed to prevent a nuclear incident that would be catastrophic for Ukraine and the world at large. We therefore align ourselves with all demands to restore the integrity of the power plant and appeal to the parties to ensure compliance with the 5 basic principles for protecting the plant during the military conflict as outlined by the Director General in this Council in May this year. Madam President, I wish also to express our indignation at reports of ongoing gender abuse and conflict-related sexual violence against the women and girls. As we are well aware, the conditions of women and girls in conflict theaters are traumatizing enough, and for them to be subjected to such abuse is indeed tragic. All efforts must be made to hold the perpetrators of such offensive acts accountable for their actions, and also importantly, sufficient resources must be provided to support victims overcome such ordeals. As with all other conflict situations, we believe that the capacity of women in conflict resolution and peace building must be harnessed through their full and meaningful participation in peace processes that has been established to enhance the success and durability of peace. Finally, we reiterate our call to the Russian Federation to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbor Ukraine by the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you. And I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her sobering briefing. Malta strongly condemns Russia's continued escalation of the war and its blunt disregard for international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. We deplore the continued killing of civilians. International law is clear. Civilians and civilian infrastructure cannot and must not be a target. As things stand, the number of Ukrainians in need of emergency humanitarian aid and protection has now reached 18 million. President, the devastating situation has been further exacerbated by the massive flooding caused by the destruction of the Kahova Dam on 6 June, which left behind an unconfirmed number of people killed and injured. Over 700,000 people in Ukraine now face significant shortages of drinking water. This attack also brought with it irreversible environmental damage, since the Dnipro River has now been contaminated with 150 tons of industrial lubricant. We are deeply concerned that the Russian Federation has also, so far, declined the UN's request to access the temporarily occupied areas in order to provide humanitarian assistance to those who need it. We once again urge Russia to act in compliance with its obligations under international law and spare no effort to make sure that humanitarian aid reaches those who are suffering as a result of this destruction. Accountability and holding the perpetrators responsible is essential. Let us also remember that dropping water levels of the dam affect access to critical cooling water for the reactors of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The risks currently posed to nuclear safety and security in Ukraine due to the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are a direct consequence of Russia's illegal, unjustified, and unprovoked war against Ukraine. Malta calls for the return of full legitimate control over the facility to the competent Ukrainian authorities, including full demilitarization and the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a first and urgent priority. This remains a key prerequisite for restoring nuclear safety and security, as well as upholding of international law. We remain supportive of the IAEA's continued effort to finding a permanent solution for the safety and integrity of the Zaporizhzhia plant. In addition to the ongoing ICC and ICJ processes, in May this year, Malta joined the enlarged partial agreement on the registry of damages caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, set up with the Council of Europe. The devastating impacts of Russia's war on children, women, and men will be felt for generations. Cases of indiscriminate killing of civilians, torture, and other forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, sexual and gender-based violence, and abductions and forcible deportation of children perpetrated by the Russian Federation have now been widely documented. I conclude by highlighting the importance of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which extends beyond Ukraine and affects global food security. It is of great importance that this process is further extended and secured beyond July between all parties to alleviate pressures on food security all over the globe. Malta strongly believes that there can be no peace without justice. We urge Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally, completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This is the only step that can lead towards a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam President,
agradezco a
I
la
thank
Secretaria General
Under Secretary
Adjunta
General
de Asuntos Políticos
For
y
political
de
and
Consolidación
peace-building
de la Paz,
affairs,
Rosemary
Ms.
DiCarlo,
Rosemary DiCarlo,
por su
for
información,
her
por su
briefing
exposición.
delivered today and the
Cuando
information
estamos por
contained in
concluir
it.
el primer semestre de
As
este nuevo
we
periodo
are
del
about to
Ecuador,
mark the end of the
como
first six-month
miembro
period of Ecuador's new
electo
term as an
en el
elected
Consejo
member
de
on the
Seguridad,
Security Council,
lamentamos
we
que
regret
no obstante los
that in
repetidos
spite
llamados
the
realizados por mi
repeated appeals
delegación
made by my
y la
delegation and
mayoría
indeed
de
by the majority
delegaciones
of delegations
a la Federación
to the
Rusa
Russian Federation
para
to
que
comply
cumpla
with
con la
the
Carta de la
UN
ONU,
Charter,
con el derecho
with international
internacional
law,
y con la
and
decisión
with
de
the
la Corte
decision
Internacional de
of the
Justicia de
ICJ
suspender sus
that is
operaciones
the
militares contra
appeals to
Ucrania.
cease its military operations
Estas
against
operaciones
Ukraine. We
siguen en
regret the
curso.
fact that these operations continue to be
Esa
waged.
agresión contra la
This
soberanía
attack
e
against the
integridad
sovereignty and
territorial de un
territorial
Estado
integrity of a
no tiene
state
cabida
has
en un
no
orden
place in an
internacional
international
basado en las
rule-based order,
normas y en la
nor
convivencia
does it have
pacífica
any
entre las
place in
naciones.
a system based on the
Más
peaceful
aún,
coexistence of
menoscaba
nations.
los esfuerzos
Furthermore,
que
this
perseguimos
attack
de un
undermines
mundo
our
más
efforts to
justo y
bring
equitativo.
about a fairer and more equitable world.
Lamentamos que
We
siga
regret
ignorándose el
that the
pedido
resounding call
determinante de la
issued
amplia
by the
mayoría de
vast
Estados
majority of
miembros de
member
esta
states of this
organización
organization
de poner
for an
fin a la
end to the
ocupación militar
military
y
occupation
que en
continues
ese
to fall
contexto
on deaf ears, and
siga
we
viva
regret
la
the fact
amenaza
that
de un
against this
desastre
backdrop,
nuclear
the threat of
en
a nuclear
Zaporilla,
disaster in Zaporizhia
cuyas
remains very much
instalaciones y
alive.
territorio
The
deben
facilities
ser
and territory
restituidas
of the
sin
Zaporizhia
condiciones
plant must be
al pueblo de
returned
Ucrania.
unconditionally to the people of Ukraine.
Insistimos en la
We
necesidad
insist
de que cesen las
upon
narrativas
the
y
need
acciones
for the
corrosivas
cessation of
que
corrosive
puedan
narratives
resultar
and
en
actions
malas
which can
interpretaciones
ultimately lead to
o errores de
misinterpretation
cálculo,
and
y
miscalculations.
deploramos que se haya iniciado el desplazamiento de armas nucleares
We
tácticas
call
en
for the
Belarus.
end of programs
Le
which have initiated
exigimos
the
a la
placement of
Federación
tactical
de
nuclear
Rusia
weapons in
que
Belarus.
permita el
We
acceso del
demand
personal
that the Russian
y de la
Federation
ayuda
allow
humanitaria
the access of humanitarian
sin
personnel and aid
y que
without
no
restrictions.
obstaculice ese
Russia must
esfuerzo
not
que la
hinder
situación
these
obliga.
humanitarian efforts that the
Insistimos
situation
en la necesidad de las
requires. We
partes de
insist
cumplir
on the
con el
fact that it
derecho
is necessary
internacional
for parties
humanitario
to uphold
y le
international
exigimos, por
humanitarian
tanto,
law,
a
and
Rusia
consequently we
que
call
detenga
upon
el uso
Russia
de
to
drones y
cease the
misiles
use of
que
drones and
tanto daño
missiles,
hacen
which are
y
doing
siguen
so much
causando a la
damage
población
to
civil y a las
civilians and
infraestructuras
critical
críticas.
civilian infrastructure.
Recordamos que
We
esta guerra
recall that this
sigue
war
deteriorando
continues
la
to
situación
worsen the
humanitaria en
humanitarian
Ucrania
situation in
y
Ukraine,
sigue
and it
debilitando al
continues
resto del
to
mundo,
wreak suffering across the rest
incluyendo
of the
en
world,
materia
including
energética y de
in terms of
seguridad
energy supply
alimentaria.
and food
En ese
security.
contexto
And all of
de
this
un
is taking
incremento
place
absurdo
in the
del gasto
context of
militar
an absurd
global.
increase in global military
Si bien
expenditure.
me referiré de
Whilst I
manera más
did
amplia a la
indeed more
cuestión del
broadly discuss
suministro de
the
armas
issue of weapons
en la
supply
sesión
at
de
the
junio
meeting held on the
29
29th of
de
June,
este Consejo, no puedo
in this
dejar de
chamber,
reiterar
I
hoy
am
la
compelled
gravedad que supone el suministro
today
de armas
return to
en
just how
violación
serious
de las
it is to
resoluciones del
supply
Consejo de
arms in
Seguridad.
violation of Security
Más
Council
aún, para
resolutions. This is
alimentar
all the more
esfuerzos de
serious if
guerra.
these arms are being transferred
Señora
to fuel
Presidenta,
war efforts. Madam
debo
President, I
reiterar
must
el apoyo de
reiterate
mi
my
país
country's
a los
support for
esfuerzos de la
the efforts
Organización de las Naciones
of the
Unidas
UN
en
organization
diferentes
in different
ámbitos.
fields.
Desde el inicio de la
Indeed,
invasión,
these efforts have been conducted since
desde
the
la
very beginning
iniciativa del
of the
grano
invasion. We can
del
point
Mar
to
Negro
the
hasta los
Black
esfuerzos
Sea
de
Grain
liberación de
Initiative,
prisioneros,
efforts to
la
release
acción
prisoners,
humanitaria
humanitarian
o las
action,
labores de
or
seguridad
work to
nuclear
increase nuclear
son
safety.
apenas algunos
These are all
ejemplos.
just
El
a
rol
few
de la
examples
Asamblea
of the
General
UN's work. The
ha sido
exemplary
ejemplar
role
en el
of
momento de
the
defender
General
los
Assembly
principios de la Carta.
has been
Llamamos por
absolutely flawless when
por lo
defending
tanto, a
the
este
principles of the
Consejo
Charter.
a
As such,
dotar
we
al
call
Secretario
upon this
General de
Council
mayores
to follow that
herramientas
example and
para
to
que se
equip the
profundice
Secretary
en los
General with
esfuerzos
more tools
encaminados
so that efforts
a una solución
designed to
pacífica
bring about a
que
peaceful
ponga
solution
punto
to the
final
conflict can
a
be
esta
ratcheted
página
up. This
oscura en la
solution must
historia de la
allow
humanidad.
humanity to turn this dark page of
Finalmente,
its story
a fin
once and for all.
de encaminarnos
Finally,
hacia
in
una
order
solución
to
dialogada,
make it
es
possible to
importante
move towards a
trabajar
negotiated
desde las
solution, it is
coincidencias.
important to begin by
En la
building on
sesión
areas
del
of common
pasado
ground.
30 de mayo,
In the meeting held on
destaqué
May
que la seguridad
30th, I
nuclear
underscored
era
the
un
fact that
elemento
nuclear
común de las
safety and
diferentes
security was
propuestas y
an
esquemas
area
de
of
paz,
common ground,
ya sea el
cutting
plan
across various
de 10
peace
puntos del
proposals and
presidente
frameworks,
Zelensky
be
o
these
los
the
12
10-point
puntos de
plan of
China.
President Zelensky or
Pero
China's
ese
12-point
no
plan.
es el
But this
único
was
punto
not
en
the
común.
only
En el marco de los
point that they had in
dispositivos de la
common.
resolución sexta
The
del 11º
sixth
periodo de
resolution
sesiones de
of the
emergencia
11th
de la
Emergency Special
Asamblea
Session
General
of the General
del 23
Assembly
de febrero
on the
pasado
23rd
sobre
of
los
February
principios
was
de la
one
Carta de la
which
ONU
referred to
subyacentes a
the
una paz
principles of the
general,
UN Charter
justa y
underlying
duradera
a
en Ucrania,
comprehensive, just and lasting
podemos y
peace in
debemos
Ukraine.
insistir en que se
And in light of
silencien
that
las
resolution,
armas.
we can and
Muchas
must
gracias.
insist that weapons fall silent. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Je remercie la
I
secrétaire générale
thank
adjointe, Madame
Under-Secretary
Rosemary
General
DiCarlo,
Ms.
pour son
Rosemary
intervention.
DiCarlo for her
Madame la
statement.
Présidente,
Madam President,
l'invasion russe
the
devait être
Russian
une affaire
invasion
de
should
quelques
have
jours,
lasted
de
a
quelques
matter
semaines.
of some
Et
days,
voilà 16 mois
weeks,
que
and
l'Ukraine
here we are,
résiste et défend sa
16 months later.
souveraineté
For
et son
16 months,
intégrité
Ukraine has
territoriale.
resisted and defended its
16 mois
sovereignty and
qu'elle tient en
territorial
échec la
integrity.
Russie
For
sur le
16
terrain.
months, it has been
Mais la
thwarting
Russie
Russia's
refuse de
attempts at victory
l'admettre
on the
et fait
ground.
chaque jour
Russia
le
refuses
choix,
to admit that,
depuis le
and
24
every day
février
since the
2022,
24th of
de
February
prolonger sa
2022,
guerre
it has chosen to
d'agression,
prolong
dont
its
les
war of
conséquences
aggression.
délétères
The
ne
harmful
cessent
consequences
d'augmenter et
of
de
which
s'étendre pour la
continue
population
to grow
ukrainienne,
and
mais
grow
aussi
in
pour le
scope
reste du
for
monde.
the people of Ukraine, but also for the rest
La
of the
Russie
world.
s'entête dans sa stratégie
Russia
cynique
persists
visant
in
à
its
détruire
cynical
les
strategy
infrastructures
aiming to
civiles
destroy
ukrainiennes
Ukrainian
en
civilian
violation
infrastructure in
flagrante
flagrant
du droit
violation of
international et
international
humanitaire.
humanitarian law.
Les attaques sur
The
la capitale
attacks on
ukrainienne et
Ukraine's
d'autres
capital
grandes
and
villes
other
sont
major cities in the
incessantes.
country are
Vendredi
unrelenting.
dernier,
Last Friday,
la Russie n'a
Russia
pas
did
hésité à
not
viser
bulk
Kiev et sa région,
targeting
alors que s'y
Kiev and
trouvait
its
une mission
region,
de dirigeants africains
whilst at the
venus
same time
promouvoir
there was
une
a mission
initiative
of
de paix.
African leaders that had
Ces
visited
frappes
to
sont
promote
conduites
a
au moyen
peace
de missiles
initiative.
russes
These
et de
strikes are
drones
conducted
Shahed
using
iraniens.
Russian
Ces derniers
missiles
ayant
and
été
Iranian
transférés en
Shahed
violation de
drones.
la
The
résolution
latter have been
2231 de
transferred
ce
in
Conseil.
violation of Security Council
Un
Resolution
nouveau seuil a été
2231.
franchi avec la
A new
destruction du
threshold was
barrage de
breached with the
Kharkova
destruction
dans la
of
nuit
the
du 5 au
Kharkova
6 juin.
Dam in the night of the 5th
Celle-ci
to the 6th of
constitue
June.
l'atteinte la plus
That
grave
was
aux
the
infrastructures
most
civiles
serious
ukrainiennes
attack waged
depuis le
against
début du
Ukrainian
conflit, comme
civilian
l'a souligné
infrastructure
Martin
since the
Griffith
beginning
lors
of
de
the
notre dernière
conflict,
réunion.
and that was underscored by
La
Martin
France s'est
Griffiths
mobilisée
during
dès
our
le
last
début
meeting.
pour venir en soutien
France
aux
mobilized
populations
immediately
ukrainiennes
to assist
déplacées et directement
those
affectées par
Ukrainian
les
people
destructions du
displaced and
barrage
directly
et
affected
salue
by
la
the
réponse
destruction of the
humanitaire
dam, and we
rapide et
welcome the
substantielle
expeditious and
apportée par les
substantial
Nations
humanitarian
Unies.
response provided
Elle
by the
appelle la
United
Russie à
Nations.
respecter
We
ses
call upon
obligations
Russia
au
to
titre du droit
uphold its
international
obligations under
humanitaire
international
et à
humanitarian
permettre
law
l'accès
and
des
to
acteurs
allow
humanitaires au
access
territoire sous son contrôle.
of humanitarian workers
Madame
to
la
the territories
Présidente,
under its control.
la
Madam
Russie
President,
continue de
Russia
manier une
continues to
rhétorique
wield
nucléaire
nuclear
agressive et
rhetoric that is
irresponsable de la
aggressive
part
and
d'un État
irresponsible
doté.
on the part of a nuclear
Il y a
weapon
une
state.
semaine,
1 week
le
ago,
président russe
the
annonçait
Russian
avoir
president
transféré de
announced that
premières
there
armes
had been the
nucléaires sur le
transfer of
territoire
Russia's first
biélorusse,
nuclear weapons to
aggravant
Belarusian
ainsi une
territory.
situation déjà
That worsens
instable.
an already
Elle
unstable
poursuit par ailleurs son
situation.
entreprise de
Elsewhere,
vassalisation de la Biélorussie,
moreover, it is
autre
continuing its
illustration
endeavor
criante de
to
son projet
subjugate
impérialiste
Belarus,
et de ses
and that is another
prétentions
blatant
à mettre une
demonstration of
partie
its
de l'Europe
imperialist
sous
ambitions and
tutelle.
its attempts to put a
Parmi
part
les
of
effets
Europe under
délétères de l'agression
trusteeship.
russe,
Under the
nous avons
deleterious
aussi
effects of
alerté à de
Russia's
nombreuses
aggressions, we've
reprises
also
dans
on
cette
several
enceinte sur
occasions in this
l'aggravation
chamber
de
sounded the
l'insécurité
alarm
alimentaire
regarding the
pour de
worsening
nombreux
of
pays.
food insecurity in many
La Russie fait
countries.
courir le risque
Russia
que le
is running
premier
the risk of
anniversaire
seeing
des
the
accords
first
d'Istanbul en juillet
anniversary
prochain
of the
soit le
Istanbul
dernier,
Accords
car elle
next
menace de
July
se
being the
retirer de
last, because
l'initiative
Russia is
céréalière
threatening
en
to
mer Noire.
withdraw from the Black Sea Grain
Ce
Initiative.
chantage est
This blackmail
inacceptable.
is
La Russie doit par
unacceptable.
ailleurs cesser ses entraves au
Moreover, Russia
fonctionnement du
must
centre de coordination
cease
conjoint
placing
dont
impediments on the
l'activité
work
est
of the
sensiblement réduite
JCC.
depuis le mois de
The
mai.
JCC's activity has decreased
Madame la
significantly
Présidente,
since May.
il nous
Madam
faut
President,
continuer à
we must
soutenir
continue
l'Ukraine
to
par
support
tous les
Ukraine
moyens
by all
pour
means
mener une
possible
contre-offensive
so
efficace
that it can
et
wage an
exercer
effective
son droit à la
counter-offensive
légitime
and
défense
exercise its
conformément à
right to
l'article
self-defense in
51 de la
accordance
Charte.
with Article
Ce
51
soutien
of the
est
Charter.
primordial
This support is
avec lui
of
se joue la
paramount importance
possibilité
because
d'une paix
the possibility
juste
of a
et
just
durable,
and lasting peace
c'est-à-dire
depends on
d'une
it.
paix
In other
ancrée
words,
dans
a
la
peace
Charte des
anchored
Nations
in the
Unies
United
et
Nations
conforme au
Charter
droit
and one which is in
international.
accordance with
Une paix choisie
international
par le
law.
peuple
A
ukrainien
peace
et non
chosen by the
dictée par
Ukrainian
l'agresseur.
people
Cette
and
paix
not
ne peut être
dictated
un
by the
cessez-le-feu
aggressor.
qui viendrait
This
geler la ligne de
peace
front
cannot be a
et consacrer
ceasefire which would
l'annexion des
freeze the
territoires
front line
occupés
and
par la
enshrine the
Russie.
annexation
Le
of
23 février
territories
dernier,
occupied by Russia. On the 23rd of February, 141 states spoke out in support of this just and lasting peace, the first stage of which is the respect of Ukraine's territorial integrity. It is in this spirit that France supports the Ukrainian peace plan. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
Наше сегодняшнее заседание
Today's
проходит на
meeting
весьма
is taking
примечательном
place
фоне.
against a very important backdrop and noteworthy
Подгоняемые
backdrop.
западными
What the
спонсорами,
Western
перед
sponsors
которыми
have been
Украине надо
egging
отчитаться об
on, where
эффективности
the
своих усилий
Ukrainians
по
have to
использованию
report to
поставленных
them about their
вооружений и
efforts on the
боеприпасов.
use of weapons and munitions that have been
Вооруженные
provided.
силы
The
Украины вот
Ukrainian
уже
armed
почти
forces
месяц
for nearly
проводят
a month now
самоубийственное
have been
контрнаступление на
carrying out a
российской позиции.
suicidal counteroffensive against
Оно
Russian
уже
positions.
стоило им
This
десятков
has
тысяч
already
мобилизованных,
cost them tens
нескольких
of
сотен
thousands of
единиц
mobilized
бронетехники
persons, several
и
hundred
называется в
armored
украинском
vehicles,
обществе не
and is
иначе, как
called in
Запорожская
Ukrainian society as nothing other than the Zaporozhka
По
meat
аналогии с
grinder.
Бахмутовской
Similarly
мясорубкой,
to
куда
the
киевский режим
Bakhmut
в
meat
течение
grinder,
нескольких
where the
месяцев
Kiev regime
отправлял
over
на
the course
верную
of several
смерть
months
украинских солдат,
sent
только чтобы
Ukrainian
доказать
soldiers to
западным
certain
поставщикам
death
оружия, что
just
Украина может победить
to prove to the
Разумеется,
Western
доказать
providers
удалось
of weapons
только
that
обратное, о
Ukraine
чем Зеленский и
can
его клика сегодня
vanquish
пытаются
Russia.
внести.
Of course, this is something. Of course,
Теперь перед
what
ними
was
стоит задача
evidenced was the
посерьезнее, как из
opposite in
полного
Ukrainian.
фиаско и разгрома сделать
Zelensky and his
победу,
clique prefer
перемогу
to sweep this under the rug. Now they have
Решать эту
another
задачу
more
вместе с
serious
ними силится в
fiasco
Вашингтоне, Лондоне и
to
Брюсселе, где об Украине
and
как
addressing
таковой и
this is
ее
something
интересах
which
никогда не
Washington,
было.
London, and Brussels is
Сегодня на
attempting to
фоне всего
achieve, where
происходящего еще
Kiev
более очевидно,
has never been
что эта
concerned for
страна
those interests. Today,
интересует их
against this
лишь как
backdrop,
инструмент ослабления или
what is
хотя бы
happening is clear,
сдерживания
where
России.
what they are interested is to
По
have
этой
a tool
причине
for weakening or at least
никакого разговора о
deterrence
мире
of the Russian
марионеточному
Federation. Against this
киевскому режиму
backdrop,
вести не дадут.
they won't
Во
be allowed to
всяком
have
случае,
any
пока
discussion
украинцы
about
еще не
the
закончат.
marionette-like
Как не дали
Kiev
этого сделать в марте
regime, and
прошлого
this is
года, о
something
чем
the
в деталях
Ukrainians have
рассказал на
continued to
встрече с
engage in.
африканскими лидерами
Just
российский
March
президент.
last year, in detail, this was described during a meeting with
Подробно о
African
преступной
leaders by the
политике
Russian
наших
president.
бывших западных
The
партнеров на
criminal
Украине мы поговорим в
policy of our
ближайший четверг.
former
Эта
Western
тема,
partners in
безусловно,
Ukraine is
достойна
something which we will
отдельного заседания.
discuss on Thursday, and which is an
Если
issue
же
that
говорить
is
о
worthy
гуманитарных аспектах
of
ситуации на Украине, то стоило
consideration.
бы
If we were to talk
выделить
about the humanitarian aspects of the situation
катастрофические
in
последствия разрушения
Ukraine, we should
Каховской
highlight
ГЭС,
the
которые еще
devastating
долго будут
consequences of the
ощущаться и на
destruction of the
Украине, и в
Kakhovska
России.
Dam, which will long continue to reverberate both in Ukraine and Russia. Their ecosystems have irrevocably been damaged, and this will directly affect the lives of people in the affected regions. Irrevocable damage has been done to the ecology, including the Black Sea. Clearly, those in Kiev who are responsible for this terrorist attack, obsessed with the notorious counter-offensive, have no concern about the interests of their people and the future of their country. Over the time that has elapsed since the tragedy, there have been even more clear evidence that has been provided about the responsibility of this crime, not just of the Zelensky regime, but the responsibility of his Western sponsors as well. As we all know, what has been used, the HIMARS missile systems for the destruction of the dam, that these systems can only be used by the Ukrainian forces after consent of the target with Washington. This is facts and evidence that have been set out in our letter, which was circulated as a document of the Security Council and General Assembly. In this context, we cannot but note our disappointment about how our international organization operated and continues to operate. Kiev's designs about the Kakhovska Dam is something which we warned the Secretary General about in a letter dated 21 October last year, and yet nothing was done. Where are the notorious, lauded leadership of the United Nations? Why was preventive work not done with Ukraine? Instead of this, UN representatives today are lamenting the absence of humanitarian access to Russian territory, which was affected after the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. There's a need here to clarify the situation and to recall the following issues and factors which the United Nations either failing to mention or distorting. Since February of 2022, Russia actively advanced the pursuit of international humanitarian assistance through the United Nations and the ICRC to the civilian population in Donbass, which has been forced over the course of several years to endure barrages of shelling and the complete isolation from the Kiev regime. In Moscow, regular cooperation was organized with humanitarian actors. OCHA representatives were invited. However, in practice, the noble statements of representatives of the United Nations about a desire to help those in need did not result in any concrete efforts or results. The leadership of the organization had neither considered nor does it currently consider any options to provide assistance to Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, to Zaporozhye and Kherson Oblast, except from Kiev by crossing the line of military confrontation. The main reason for these kinds of harsh approaches are not humanitarian in nature, but rather they are purely political, not to help the victims, but rather to show that apparently or allegedly the Kiev regime allegedly maintains control over these territories. Russia, for its part, continuously drew the attention of UN representatives to the absence of necessary safety and security conditions against the backdrop of active hostilities, high risks of sabotage and provocation, the fact that areas have been riddled with mines, and this effectively makes access across the line of military confrontation impossible. We repeatedly propose that options be considered for the provision of assistance from internal regions in Russia by established routes where provisions to Donbass had already been carried out. These proposals were all declined by the United Nations for the benefit of Kiev and its Western sponsors, showing once again double standards and openly political humanitarian agendas being advanced with slogans and calls for civilian population. They are obediently, without pangs of conscience, advancing those political agendas. We would note that after the devastation of the dam in Kherson Oblast, a large-scale humanitarian operation was carried out. The Russian emergency forces saved nearly 2,000 people, including hundreds of children. More than 6,000 people were evacuated from 36 flooded towns. The effectiveness of our efforts applied in Ukraine, attempting and was used by Ukraine, which attempted to use the frameworks for their own operations. At the same time, the Russian Federation continues to do everything possible to facilitate alleviation of the suffering. The Kiev authorities continue to shell civilian objects. On 10 July, the Ukrainian forces used the Storm Shadow to target evacuation point. One woman died. These egregious violations by the Kiev regime are left without consideration, and the United Nations is attempting to sweep them under the rug. And the Talyata, including the devastation of the Talyata-Odessa ammonia pipeline. And the UN representatives continue to keep afloat the grain initiatives, despite its clear commercial, not humanitarian nature. And this is despite the fact that the Russian side of this was not implemented. And the explosion of our pipeline placed all of the dots on the I's. Madame Di Carlo, who is eager to hastily accuses the Russian Federation when we talk about the crimes of Ukraine, the Secretariat demonstrates incredible ignorance. Let us recall that the blowing up of the pipeline was carried out from Ukrainian territory. Are you trying to once again blame us for blowing up our very own pipeline? We stand ready to continue to help developing countries in need both with grain and fertilizer. However, covering commercial supplies of grain from Ukraine to Western states under slogans of protection of the interests of those in need is something which we refuse to do. In the poorest country, contrary to the assertions of the Undersecretary General, they received less than 3% of all food deliveries. Distinguished colleagues, given the failing counteroffensive, the Kiev regime has resorted to its favorite practice, attempting to draw the Western community's attention to high-profile crimes or stagings, where blame is, of course, pinned on the Russian Federation. This happened in April of 2022 with Bucha, and this is the objective of the situation around Kakhovka. And now the increasingly frequent paranoidal allegations of Kiev regime leaders that Russia allegedly mined the Zaporizhia plant and is preparing to blow it up are concerning to us. The absurdity of this is something which the IAEA mission saw for itself, headed by Mr. Grossi, who visited the station recently despite the obstacles from Ukraine. We hope that Western sponsors of the Kiev regime will bring it to reason and to prevent a disaster which can affect much of Europe. As we repeatedly saw for ourselves, Zelensky himself and his clique in Europe and in Ukraine and in Europe couldn't care less about this. If you noted, Madam, since the beginning of the so-called counteroffensive, one of the main goals, themes in a noteworthy way, coincided with the complete absence of reports about alleged attacks by Russian missiles and drones targeting residential homes and objects in civilian areas. The latest such high-profile episode occurred in Odessa when Ukrainian missile targeted the roof of a home and resulted in devastation. This came from an information space, despite the fact that attacks targeting infrastructure and objects related to Ukraine in Ukrainian cities are being carried out on an almost daily basis. This all bears out what we have long been pointing to, and which Ukrainian citizens know perfectly well. What's most important, the most important, if not only danger of Ukrainian cities is what are deployed there in violation of international humanitarian law, Ukrainian anti-aircraft systems. When they do not exist or when they are deployed outside of the cities, only munitions, storage sites, and military barracks and other military objects are blown up, as well as energy infrastructure, which are involved in the provisions of weapons, Western weapons. Attacks will continue as part of the advancement of one of the goals of the special military operation, namely demilitarization of Ukraine. This has already resulted in the fact that its own weapons to the country, that the country has almost none of its own weapons, and the Kiev regime is relying almost completely on Western provisions, and this is something which we'll talk about in detail on Thursday. Today, the countries, specifically U.S., Albania, the United Kingdom, allege that the Russian Federation perpetrated another provocation and conducted a missile strike against Kiev during the presence of an African delegation there with their peace proposal. African leaders who visited Kiev denied allegations of the Kiev regime about the missile strike targeting Kiev during their presence there. And this is yet another another staging by Western sponsors. Let us quote a Ukrainian news site. The delegation from South Africa, headed by President Ramaphosa, denies a missile strike by the Russian Federation. And this was announced by the press secretary of the president, Vincent Magwende. He said that he took a video from a hotel in Kiev when the so-called incident occurred next. So it's strange that we never saw nor heard the explosion. Apparently, there is deliberate misinformation being spread here. During the alarm, people were simply going about their day-to-day lives. As we expect, the mission will be seen, but some of the obstacles are very alarming and others are strange, such as the so-called explosion. When he was asked a clarifying question whether he denies the explosion in Kiev, from his own experience and those of others, yes, I deny this. We were all surprised when we were brought back to the hotel and we traveled along roads where people were going about their day-to-day lives. This is very strange, and this is a deliberate disinformation campaign. This is an example of how Ukrainian propaganda of misinformation is being carried out, and how Western sponsors of Kiev eagerly lap this up. Today, Madam President, we are seeing further attempts by the United States and its allies to force the UN Secretary to carry out the so-called investigation into alleged provisions of Iranian drones for the use in Ukraine. Before today's meeting, we already set out our assessments to journalists. To put it concisely, we and the Ukrainians both categorically deny these fabrications. There has been no iota of any credible evidence provided from the Kiev regime, neither to us nor the Iranians, who, for the sake of this, agreed to bilateral consultations. Attempts to drag into this adventure the so-called 2231 cell is liable to cast doubt on the commitment of the UN Secretariat to this statute. The cell is not a sanctions committee, and it is not a panel of experts. Its members were not appointed by member states as experts in specific disarmament or other areas. We hope that the Secretary General has sufficient wisdom not to be misled by our former Western partners. Madam, yesterday was a day of memory and grief. On this day, 82 years ago, fascist Germany attacked the Soviet Union. In the fight against fascist aggressors, 27 million residents of the Soviet Union perished. Today, like then, German tanks are once again firing on our soldiers in Ukraine. There's a difference, however, behind the backs of the Nazi regime, which entrenched itself in Kiev is not just Germany, but also the United States and its NATO allies. In these years, what has not changed is the hatred of our country and the desire to inflict a strategic loss on our country, to loot our natural resources, and to impoverish our people. But these plans will not materialize, nor was this fated to materialize 82 years ago. In the same way, German tanks are burning and other Western equipment is burning, and is burning alongside the unmaterialized hopes of the Nazis and the sponsors to vanquish the Russian Federation. They, like 80 years ago, will be met with bitter disappointment. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I would like to join others in thanking Under-Secretary General De Carlo for her informative briefing, and I welcome Ukraine's participation at today's meeting. Under-Secretary General De Carlo, as you highlighted, the recent trend of military escalation and the threat of spillover is of huge concern. Both will only serve to cause greater suffering to civilians and create knock-on effects for regional and global stability. You've also rightly underlined the importance of political and diplomatic efforts to set this conflict on the path to peace, and we urge all actors working towards that end to combine their efforts and to heed your call for the full respect of international humanitarian law throughout the duration of this conflict. To this end, I want to make 2 points today. First, we must continue to take meaningful steps towards a political resolution to this war. In her recent visit to Kyiv, the UAE Special Envoy for Ukraine, Her Excellency Miriam Al-Maheri, conveyed to President Zelensky our steadfast commitment to a just and peaceful outcome in Ukraine and our full support to their humanitarian needs. We welcome also the efforts of the Africa Peace Initiative's presidential delegation, who recently visited both Kyiv and Moscow and made a call for peace, demonstrating global support for the stabilization of the world order. While this conflict seems intractable, today we must engage in the practical steps necessary to alleviate human suffering and engage in trust-building exercises between the two countries. The UAE is trying to do its part. We continue to support prisoner exchange initiatives. We strongly support the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which remains vital for global food security, and we will support its full operationalization with practical measures. And we encourage the full implementation of the MOU on Russian fertilizers and food products in the ongoing discussion. Second, the humanitarian situation must remain our clear focus today and in the coming days and weeks ahead. During her visit, Minister Al-Maheri had a direct and clear-eyed view of the dire humanitarian situation on the ground in Ukraine. She underlined the UAE's unwavering humanitarian support to all people affected by the conflict. As such, the UAE is distributing $100 million of aid for Ukraine. With 53% of energy facilities in the country impacted by the fighting, the UAE's donation includes generators and LED lights for civilians. We are also providing supplies for newborns and babies, as well as a grant of $4 million for programs supporting the welfare of orphaned children under the Olena Zelenska Foundation. As the conflict prevents millions of children and students from attending classes, the UAE will also donate 2,500 laptops to those affected so that they can benefit from remote learning. Children must remain the focus of our efforts, and their rights should be upheld and protected at all costs. The weight of war falls heaviest on children. We are dismayed by reports of violations against the children of Ukraine. All parties must meet their obligations for the protection of children caught up in this war. 530 have so far already lost their lives and their futures. We stress once again the importance of humanitarian services reaching all those in need. The safety of humanitarians responding to the Kakova Dam flooding must be assured. All parties must comply with their obligations under international law, and we encourage all relevant actors to facilitate the life-saving work of humanitarian actors. We are also acutely aware of the dark potential of a nuclear accident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This has been addressed numerous times in this chamber, and the name Chernobyl echoed with good reason. We continue to monitor the situation closely, and we welcome the continued efforts of the IAEA, including Director General Grossi's visit last week and the work of the IAEA teams on the ground, to avoid a nuclear accident that would have devastating and long-lasting consequences for decades to come. The UAE emphasizes the importance of the continued non-use of nuclear weapons. The world has avoided their use for the past 77 years. This must be maintained. Nuclear rhetoric is dangerous and destabilizing and undermines efforts to forge peace. We must all see this as a collective red line. Ultimately, de-escalation, diplomacy, dialogue are the only way forward. None of us could have imagined in March 2022, during the first UAE presidency, when the conflict had just started, that we would continue to see such significant escalation almost a year later. We urge the international community to redouble all efforts to ensure that future generations are not scarred by the failure to maintain international peace and security on our watch. The UAE will continue its humanitarian work and its support for all mediation efforts in the meantime. We stand ready to assist genuine efforts to bring the war to a just, sustainable end in line with the UN Charter. Thank you. I will now resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary Di Carlo. I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. His intervention today, as usual, was as sincere and as perverse and cynical as his war party Gauleiter's words a year ago, who said, according to the Russian official tweet, "The goal of Russia's special military operation is to stop any war that could take place on Ukrainian territory or that could start from there." 2 weeks ago, this criminal regime blew up the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant in an attempt to prevent Ukraine's possible counteroffensive actions across the Dnipro River. This was yet another blatant violation of the ICJ order of the 16th of March 2022. Since then, Ukraine has done its utmost to mitigate the immediate consequences of this act of terror and ecocide, evacuating people, providing them with humanitarian aid, ensuring access to drinking water for the local population, and prevention of infectious diseases have been among the key priorities of my government. Systematic work marked with the engagement of the UN and other international actors has been organized on the right bank of the Dnipro River. At the same time, the left bank has been turned by the Russian occupiers into no-go zone, closed even for the United Nations. It is appalling that Russia not only refused to rescue the local population in the affected areas under its temporary military control, it also declined the UN request to access these areas. We commend the UN humanitarian activities in the Ukraine-controlled part of the Kherson region and support the UN in seeking the necessary access to the areas temporarily occupied by Russia. To this end, the government of Ukraine has promptly provided all security guarantees to the UN for fulfilling humanitarian operations in the entire affected area. We echo the call by the UN humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, Denise Brown, on the Russian authorities to act in accordance with their obligations under the international humanitarian law and grant access to people in the occupied territory who urgently need life-saving assistance. The situation there remains critical, and the number of people reported missing so far, 109 people, may not fully reflect the grim reality. While in the occupied areas Russia simply denies access, it also tries to undermine the humanitarian operations in Ukraine-controlled areas with unbated shelling. For instance, on June 20th, a rescue team of the State Emergency Service of Ukraine came under Russian fire in Kherson. One rescuer was killed and 8 others were wounded. As stated by UN Ukraine in relation to this incident, it was yet another example of the human impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A comprehensive assessment of the implications of this act of terror is yet to be made, although it is clear that we are dealing with one of the biggest man-made disasters in Europe for decades. In particular, oil pollutants that weigh at least 150 tons are drifting along the Dnipro River and may reach the Mediterranean. The Kakhovka reservoir is decimated with about 95,000 tons of dead fish. 500 square kilometers of Ukrainian forests have been flooded, and at least half of them will die. 20,000 wild animals that inhabited the flooded area could hardly survive. Distinguished colleagues, it is a matter of alarm that, according to intelligence information, Russia is considering a scenario of a terrorist attack at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with radiation leakage. The dam explosion has made it clear that Russia is ready to apply a scorched earth tactic in response to the deteriorating military situation on the ground in the captured lands they doubt they can hold. We therefore urge the international community to take the threat of this act of nuclear terror seriously and to step up pressure on the Russian Federation to prevent these menacing developments, including, but not limited, to introducing strengthened restrictive measures against the Russian nuclear industry and military-industrial complex. We also expect an objective assessment by IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi regarding Russia's criminal actions. Only strong and adequate steps aimed at reducing Moscow's capabilities to inflict harm regionally and globally will contribute to resolving the crisis created by Russia. The military defeat of Russia in Ukraine and ensuring accountability for the crime of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity are the necessary elements of this resolution. Appeasement options, such as territorial concessions to Russia and temporary freezing of the conflict, will only serve as delayed action mines with the detonator in the hands of the Kremlin. If such an option is implemented, the resulting explosion, given the damage to the principles of the UN Charter, will reverberate throughout the world. Any terrorist act aims at intimidating and generating fear. This is precisely how the Kremlin regime attempts to achieve its aggressive goals. Russia has heavily fortified the occupied Ukrainian territory, but it does not believe in these fortification structures or its own troops' resilience. That is why Russia blew up the dam and mined Zaporizhzhia NPP to intimidate the international community. That is why it fills its own army with convicted criminals and deploys blocking units behind the Russian positions, tasking them to give soldiers in the first line of defense no escape from combat. The killing of those Russian soldiers attempting to retreat are evidenced by the testimonies of captured Russians, as well as video footage captured recently by Ukrainian drones. Despite the occupied areas having been heavily fortified, in some areas Ukrainian soldiers continue to move forward. In some areas they defend their positions and resist Russia's intensified attacks. Ukraine will liberate all its territories, and it will take as long as necessary, because we value the lives of our soldiers and civilians and do not apply the strategy of human wave attacks and total destruction of civilian infrastructure. Madam President, we appreciate the efforts of those nations who express their willingness to contribute to genuine peace, which will testify to the persistent validity and credibility of the UN Charter. The UN General Assembly has outlined the modalities of such peace in its resolution Principles of the UN Charter, underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Russia, so far, demonstrates no willingness to give up its aggressive path, deliberately insulting those nations who come up with peaceful initiatives. Russian cruise and ballistic missiles launched on Kiev during the visit of the delegation of African leaders showed Russia's real disdain for global efforts to restore peace and to protect the world from aggression. This attack was only one in an endless line of day-to-day airstrikes with missiles, MLRS, guided aerial bombs, and Iran-made attack drones, resulting in significant casualties and destruction. In particular, as of today, more than 1,000 launches by the Russian Federation of the Iranian UAVs over the territory of Ukraine have been recorded. In today's statement that was delivered at the media stakeout right before the Security Council's meeting, we said that Russia's and Iran's actions violate UN Security Council Resolution 2231. The Secretariat of the United Nations must respond to growing calls from the international community to investigate these violations. Madam President, despite the war being at its height, we have already started working on post-war recovery. The Ukraine Recovery Conference held this week in London sent a strong political message that Ukraine and allies have no doubt in the ultimate victory of my country, a victory that will guarantee a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace to the benefit of all nations. As my president said when addressing the conference, although no one has the power to cleanse the depths of human nature from the evil that sometimes rises to the surface and destroys and kills, we are able to protect life and overcome the ruins after the Russian aggression in such a way that the path for evil, for any new aggression, will be blocked. The world is watching too if we will restore normal life in such a way that our transformation will inflict an ideological defeat on the aggressor. In his speech in Paris just yesterday, Secretary General Guterres said, I quote, "In 2023, more than 750 million people do not have enough to eat. The COVID-19 pandemic and Russian invasion of Ukraine have exacerbated the situation," end of quote. In fact, Russia is worse than the COVID-19. Putin's regime is cancer, and the world cannot be strong and healthy while its cells continue to spread from Putin's bunker and form the new tumors around the world. And in fact, in this very council, in this chamber, it should be removed before it travels further in your blood and kills you. The choice is yours, ladies and gentlemen. Choose life. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. I am delivering this statement on behalf of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. I thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing and the United Arab Emirates Presidency for the opportunity to address this Council. Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, aided by Belarus, is ongoing for almost a year and a half now. Innocent people have been killed, injured, and displaced from their homes. Families have been torn apart, and children have been orphaned. The physical and emotional scars of the war will be felt for generations to come. Schools, hospitals, and other public facilities have been destroyed, leaving people without the access to essential services. According to the World Bank's assessment, carried out in collaboration with the Ukrainian government, the European Commission, and the United Nations, the reconstruction needs for the damages caused by the Russian aggression against Ukraine are estimated to be around 411 billion over the next decade. This staggering amount highlights the severity of the damages caused by the Russian aggression and the need for significant investment to rebuild the country. The calculations conducted so far, however, do not incorporate the detrimental impact of the Kakhovka Dam destruction by Russia and its humanitarian, economic, and ecological consequences. Madam President, it is unacceptable that despite the repeated calls from the United Nations on the Russian Federation to provide safety guarantees for crossing the front line to the left bank of the Dnipro River and ensure humanitarian access to all civilians impacted by the destruction of the dam, such guarantees have not yet been provided. It is imperative that Russia takes immediate action in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law to allow United Nations to provide the much-needed humanitarian aid to those affected by this devastating act, including in Oleksy. The Baltic states are among the top bilateral aid donors to Ukraine as a percentage of our GDPs. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania already provided 1.5 million euros of immediate assistance to Ukraine to alleviate the consequences of Kakhovka Dam destruction, and this does not include private initiatives. The costs of addressing the repercussions of Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a sovereign nation are consistently increasing, while only 26% of the total 3.9 billion required for the humanitarian response in Ukraine has been funded up to the point. We urge the international community to persist in providing the necessary funding. The work of the UN and its agencies to ensure close monitoring and proper documentation of massive human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law should continue. We hope for an objective and accurate assessment of the situation due to Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine in the forthcoming annual reports of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence and children in armed conflicts. Madam President, allow me to express Estonia's, Latvia's, and Lithuania's appreciation for the active UN engagement in alleviating the global consequences of Russia's aggression, including through the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Russia continues to hinder the exports of Ukrainian goods from the Ukrainian ports and thereby contributing to a significant increase in food prices on global markets. Russia also continues manipulating the facts and repeatedly threatens to end the Black Sea Grain Initiative if its demands are not met. In fact, according to available statistics, including of Russian origin, Russian exports of grain and fertilizers have been consistently high in recent years. In case of grains, they are even reached record levels. In 2022, due to higher prices, Russia's export revenues from fertilizers increased by impressive 70 to 150%, depending on the source. According to the FAO, the export volume of Russian fertilizers in 2022 has only decreased by 10%. Russia must stop blackmailing the global community and allow the Black Sea Grain Initiative to operate at its maximum potential. Finally, Madam President, our countries continue to argue for the full Russia's political and military leadership accountability for the crime of aggression. The core group of the Special Tribunal for the Russian Crime of Aggression will hold its fourth meeting in Warsaw on the 29th and 30th of June, and we call on all other states and international organizations to join our collective efforts. We will continue to stand with Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes for Ukraine to rightfully defend itself against Russia's brutal war of aggression. The only path for the comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine is the one based on full respect of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Withdrawal of Russian troops is key precondition of that. We welcome all the efforts of our global partners in reaching peace in Ukraine that are in line with Ukraine's peace formula, the UN Charter, and the international law. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, Poland appreciates the convening of today's timely meeting and duly notes all the insightful remarks delivered by Madam Undersecretary Di Carlo and other distinguished speakers. Madam President, for close to 500 very long days and nights, Russia has been ruthlessly pursuing its brutal aggression against Ukraine. During that whole time, it has also cynically dismissed all the appeals for stopping the bloodshed and removing its troops from the Ukrainian territory, no matter how loud and clear they have been, or from which corner of the world they originated. Therefore, for the last couple of weeks, the international community has been closely following the efforts of the Ukrainian armed forces determined to liberate their country from the Russian illegal occupation. In this context, let me draw your attention to the following three issues. Firstly, Russia needs to bear the full cost of the destruction its aggression has caused. With Russia's continued attacks on Ukraine's critical and civilian infrastructure, taking full scope of the reconstruction process will be an especially crucial challenge. After 16 months, it is obvious that what Russia cannot take, it will try to destroy. Shattering the livelihood of thousands of innocent civilians by blowing up the Novakharkovka Dam is just one of the most recent examples of this cruel strategy. Therefore, Poland reiterates its full support for the creation of the comprehensive registry of all the damages inflicted by the Russian invasion, followed by a close coordination and transparency of the reconstruction efforts. In this respect, we commend the Ukraine Recovery Conference that took place in London over the last 2 days. Its aim was to prepare a political, legal, and financial base that would enable comprehensive assistance for reconstruction to be provided to Ukraine. And as such, it definitely fulfilled its goals. Secondly, Ukraine has a perfect right to freely choose their alliances and partnerships. It needs to be able to decide by itself which international partners it wants to build its future prosperity with. This naturally includes security cooperation. Kiev is looking forward to concrete prospects for ensuring its security after the Russian aggression is put out, and Poland fully understands and supports this approach. Last but not least, we must bear in mind that although the process of reconstruction of Ukraine will be costly and lengthy, it is in the interest of the whole world. According to some estimates, at least 600 million consumers worldwide directly depend on Ukraine's agricultural production. We firmly believe that only a complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine can provide a chance for a just and stable peace, facilitating a long-term solution for global economic recovery and an improvement in the world food situation. Even if we manage to stop the bloodshed today, reinstate the primacy of international law, and establish peace, the consequences of this war will be felt for a very long time. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Czechia.
Well, thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Slovakia and my own country, Czechia. We fully align ourselves with the statement to be delivered by the European Union. Let me thank you for convening this important meeting, and of course I would like to thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo for her briefing, which unfortunately only adds to the bleak picture of the devastating consequences of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine. We regret that the UN Security Council must devote its attention to this issue once again simply due to Russia's utter disregard for the UN Charter and its fundamental principles. Judging by its actions in Ukraine, Russia has demonstrated time and again that it has no interest in effective multilateralism, maintenance of international peace and security, and development of friendly relations. The Russian armed forces continue to deliberately target civilians and civilian infrastructure. We strongly condemn such barbaric attacks. Therefore, let us be under no illusion about the true intentions of the Russian government. Their attack on Kiev with missiles last week, while African leaders were in the city on a diplomatic mission, speaks for itself. Madam President, we ask ourselves how many lives must be lost or ruined for this senseless war to stop. For Russia, the death toll, which keeps rising from one Security Council briefing to another, is apparently just a number on the paper. Russia's disregard for international humanitarian law and human rights is also evident in its ongoing repression of its own citizens. We were also horrified by the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam and by the very disturbing reports that the Russian forces were shelling Ukrainian rescue workers who were trying to reach flooded areas in the Kherson region. We call on Russia once again to stop immediately its aggression against Ukraine and to withdraw its troops from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and regions where Russia orchestrated its sham referenda. We will also continue to support efforts to hold fully accountable those who committed the most serious crimes under international law in Ukraine, including rape and sexual violence against women and girls. As our foreign ministers agreed during their last bilateral meeting, we will maintain our comprehensive support for Ukraine in its just struggle to preserve its statehood. Czechia and Slovakia have stood by Ukraine since the start of its defense against Russia's aggression, and we will remain steadfast in supporting Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity until this nightmare ends. And we hope that day will come soon. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Czechia for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Madam President, colleagues. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. The potential candidate Georgia, as well as Andorra and San Marino, all aligned themselves with this statement. First, I wanted to thank Under-Secretary General De Carlo for a briefing, and I wanted to take this opportunity to commend the entire UN team on the ground, led by resident coordinator Denise Brown, for the invaluable assistance that you are providing to the people of Ukraine in these very difficult times. We know the UN system is fully mobilized through humanitarian relief, support to refugees and internally displaced persons, human rights monitoring, mine action, nuclear safety, addressing the dire global consequences of Russia's aggression, and much more besides, and you have our very strong support. Madam President, as Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression approaches the tragic mark of 500 days, the people of Ukraine and the international community desire a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter and the resolutions of the General Assembly. Yet one country, the aggressor, remains steadfast in pursuing its brutal war against the neighboring country and its people. When African heads of state visited Kiev last week calling for peace, Russia responded by bombing the city, as it did when the UN Secretary General visited last year. The way to end Russia's assault on Ukraine is crystal clear. Russia must stop its war and immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its forces and proxies from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I will emphasize briefly 3 points in my intervention. One, the dramatic human rights situation in the territories temporarily occupied by Russia. 2, the importance of upholding international humanitarian law, and 3, the need for accountability. Madam President, the human rights situation in the occupied territories is of grave concern. International monitoring mechanisms, including the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and the UN Commission of Inquiry, have concluded that Russian authorities have committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine. The reported violations include indiscriminate attack against civilians and civilian infrastructure, a widespread and systematic pattern of summary executions, torture and ill treatment and unlawful confinement, as well as inhumane detention conditions, rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, and forced transfer and deportation, including of children. Many of these amount to war crimes. The last report of the Commission of Inquiry also concludes that the attacks of Ukraine's energy-related infrastructure and the use of torture by Russian authorities may amount to crimes against humanity. We call on Russia to uphold international human rights law. Its practice of forcibly issuing Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens is in blatant violation of international law, and it undermines Ukraine's sovereignty. The ICRC should be granted full and unconditional access to all detained persons, and all illegally detained Ukrainian citizens by Russia should be released. The decision by the Russian Central Election Commission to hold so-called elections in the temporarily military-occupied territories of Ukraine is yet another violation of international law, and by the way, the October GA resolution adopted by the United Nations on Ukraine's territorial integrity. Secondly, we reiterate the importance of upholding international humanitarian law. We are appalled by reports that evacuation teams rescuing civilians following the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam are being shelled. We urge the Russian Federation to cease such attacks and allow help to the affected civilian population, including in areas under Russian military control. The EU condemns the attack at the Kakhovka HPP in the strongest possible terms. It is a direct consequence of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The downstream flooding has not only put tens of thousands of civilian lives in danger, but it's also affecting water and energy supplies and causing an ecological and environmental catastrophe. As repeatedly requested by the United Nations, we urge Russia to enable safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to populations in need of assistance, in particular into the temporarily occupied territories. Aid cannot be denied to those in need. The impact of Russia's aggression on children is particularly horrific, and we look forward to the imminent publication of the Secretary General's report on children in armed conflict. Third, the EU is firmly committed to ensuring full accountability for war crimes and the other most serious crimes committed in connection with Russia's war of aggression. We emphasize the importance of coordinated accountability initiatives to combat impunity and ensure justice. We support the ongoing work for the establishment of a tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression, which is of concern to the international community as a whole. The EU welcomes the establishment of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression at Eurojust in The Hague. We're also fully supportive of the establishment of an international mechanism to register the damages Russia has inflicted, following the UN GA resolution of November 2022, which acknowledged the need for a register of damage, and the Reykjavik summit recently of the Council of Europe, the register now was established. We underlined our support for the investigations of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Madam President, the EU calls for a just, comprehensive and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and the GA resolution adopted in February, and in respect of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. A peace that will benefit all nations, as the Ukraine ambassador just said. We welcome international efforts to this effect, and we reaffirm our support to President Zelensky's peace formula. Security Council members must distinguish between the victim and the aggressor in this war of aggression. Under the UN Charter, Ukraine has the right to self-defense against Russia's attacks in order to restore its territorial integrity. It also has the right to request international support for such efforts. The EU is committed to support Ukraine in this regard for as long as it takes. I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skog for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.